Hi everyone. I decided to do this as another live because I really just do not feel like editing and piecing together a talking video, and the last live did well enough. So whether or not people are around to watch this whole live, like I'm just gonna post it and leave it up simply so that I don't have to edit because it's way too much work to edit. And I just wanted to talk about a few other things, then also address like the response videos from Day by Day and reiterate the fact that they have not contacted me yet. I did offer to pay for the vet exam if I was wrong and nothing came up. They've not contacted me yet. And my personal opinion from what I have assessed from these people is that they like being correct. So if the vet check did come back all fine and clear with zero concerns, I do think that they would have sent it back to me to try to make me look like an idiot because I said I would eat my words and publicly admit that I was wrong and pay for the vet check and show everyone that I did that. But they've not contacted me yet about that. One concern I do have about the vet video that they posted is if the vet did a full lameness exam with the horse, including flexions and everything, and the horse had no soundness issues that the vet could see, and they still chose to ultrasound and x-ray the horse, I find that a little bit suspicious, and it would make me kind of worried that their vet could be scamming them if that's actually the truth. Like obviously you can request for that to happen, so maybe they request to do extra diagnostics despite the lack of evidence showing that they needed to. But that would be one of the concerns that I have about that video is that usually when you're doing flexions and like a full lameness exam, the entire purpose of the examination is to discover certain problems. So, like for example, you do flexions, a horse flexes positive in a joint, you would then go to that leg and you would start going down the leg and doing nerve blocks and then flexing the horse again and jogging them off and seeing when they stop having that positive response to the flexion, and whichever nerve block that's associated with, you'd have a good idea like, okay, like the nerve block to the stifle stopped this horse from having a positive flexion. That means that we should look into the stifle and image the stifle. The fact that they're saying that nothing came up and that they just started blindly ultrasounding and x-raying is wild to me because like the amount of money that you would have to spend to do that without knowing at all where you're looking, like without having any concerns at all, like if no concerns came up, I would be concerned about a vet being like, let's proceed to do all of these ultrasounds and x-rays despite the fact that the horse has no clinical unsoundness issues. So that's where I would be concerned too, especially with ultrasounding, because ultrasounding is very specific to trying to find like soft tissue damage. So if you don't have a soft tissue injury concern and there's no signs of lameness, it's a very weird thing for a vet to charge for in an exam. Um, and that like I just watched the video now, and that's kind of what I took out of it that I find a bit odd. Like I have done a lot of lameness exams. Obviously, I'm not a vet. I'm not a perfect expert, but I have never had a vet just be like, "Oh, your horse is clinically completely sound, but let's just start ultrasounding and like x-raying everywhere for no reason." Because just to keep in mind, like the going rate for like x-raying a joint, like first of all, you have to pay an x-ray setup fee, which usually costs about like $300. And that includes, I think, 4 views. And to get an x-ray, like a clear view of an entire joint, you're looking at about 4 views. So that's for one joint. So to just get your fetlocks done or like the stifle done or something, you're looking at a minimum of 4 views. So that's like approximately $160 per joint just for the x-ray slides, which is why they typically don't just x-ray willy-nilly, because in order to go through all of the joints without having any idea of where you're looking at, you would be spending a lot of money. So that alone makes me question the validity of the exam, because I felt like, especially with how violently they were reacting to people suggesting that the horse is lame, I personally think that if you're in that mindset, that you would go out of your way to be like, ha ha ha, I'm right, the horse is sound, fuck you guys, ha ha ha. And if that was actually the case and you had all x-rays and ultrasounds and everything was clear, you'd post them and you'd be like, bleh, like, see, look at this, like, screw all you guys, clean x-rays. um they didn't film it, they took photos, like it was a photo, like the photos they took, it did look like the horse was being x-rayed and having a flexion exam. But the problem with it being photos, especially when they're not time stamped, is like the exam itself looks very normal for what would be a pre-purchase exam. So if they vetted this horse when they purchased him, or if they did like a trial and then vetted him while he was at their place, they very well could have had all of these photos and examples just to use and recycle, which I find suspicious. I also find it suspicious that the vet would then go back and look at a video and like assess a video after having assessed the horse after the video and then say their opinion on it. Like, I find from a professional standpoint that to be a little bit odd because whether or not the horse is lame in the video isn't fully relevant if you're vetting the horse on a different day and finding a different result. So it's a weird thing for a vet to willingly comment on because it kind of calls into question like their expertise a little bit. And I send my vets videos if I have concerns for my horses, and they will look at the videos to look at them and be like, okay, yeah, like we think we should come out, but they typically won't actually do like an assessment. And yeah, like I think that it's odd to just do X-rays willy-nilly without there being anything. Like, I would think at minimum, like, honestly, even within sound horses, this is the part where I find it really weird, especially with a horse who is probably a little bit older, but honestly, even young horses, even horses with no clinical findings that are completely sound during work, when you're doing regular vet exams with flexions, they can flex positive. So that's also where I'm kind of a little bit put off because a lot of horses will flex positive when they are sound. And I think for transparency's sake, if they're sharing about it, they could have said like, "Oh, like he flexed like 2 out of 5 lame on like this leg, so like that's why we chose to X-ray and ultrasound this leg," even just for an educational purpose. Obviously, they don't have to disclose that. Like the vet records are entirely their business. They are confidential. They don't have to disclose it at all. But if you have an entire following who is losing trust in you and has concerns, I do think that in order to try to relieve those concerns, it's not necessarily a bad thing to share them. Like when Milo was bucking a lot with me, like when he was younger, especially, he used to be really bad for it, especially after fences, and he was a wing nut. And a lot of people had suggested to me that it was kissing spine. So I got his back x-rayed because I was like, why not? I'm having the vet out here anyways. Let's go ahead. It's like only a few slides. And like we got his back x-ray to check for kissing spine. He didn't have it. And it's like, okay, awesome. So now I have these x-ray slides on hand that I could just throw around anytime someone's like, oh, he definitely has kissing spine, because it's like, no. But I also want to touch on the fact that like I can relate to day by day in being criticized and hearing things that you don't want to hear and having them make you uncomfortable, because like for years while Milo was struggling with his hoof issues, it didn't happen to the same extent as this with like this lameness issue with this horse. But I had lots of people come out and say that they did not like the shoeing packages that I was using, and that they thought it was like a Band-Aid fix, and that he wasn't fully sound, and that he was landing toe first, and that he was tripping, and that he was probably bucking after fences because his feet were sore. And I didn't want to hear it at the time. I did not want to hear that at all. It offended me. I got really defensive, and I was like, I'm doing everything I can to try to fix his feet. And we've been consulting with lots of farriers, getting different opinions, which I was doing. So that's like what I want to like kind of on a flip side is like I can relate to them. Like I was like trying to fix Milo's feet, but like the quality of care and finding like a good farrier to actually make the changes was really difficult. And I actually went through several farriers, and the problem with like an issue like that with feet is like you kind of have to give a professional enough time to potentially resolve the issue before you move on. Because if I kept moving from farrier to farrier based off of what people said online, it could have also had a worse impact on his feet. So it was a really hard position to be in. But now that I have addressed his hoof issues and come out on the other side and can see how right other people are and were when they were talking about it and saying that he could go barefoot, and that the only thing stopping him from doing so was my lack of willingness to give him time off or change the diet to make it happen. Like those things were hard to hear at the time, but now that I have done it, I can say that they were correct. And like this also isn't faulting anyone who doesn't want to give their horse the time off needed to completely transition barefoot, because it's not like that's none of my business, because he's been off for a long time and stuff. But I just wanted to bring that up because that's a really good instance of example of like I heard stuff that I didn't want to hear and like wasn't ready to hear, and that hurt me because I was trying to do my best, but I was being misled by other industry professionals that aren't necessarily as knowledgeable as they may come across. Because there's like with horse trainers, there's very few standards in place like to ensure that farriers are perpetuating good practice and like modern practice and new science-based tactics that are correct. Like there's a lot of rampantly bad farrier care, and it's the same thing with horse training. And it's really easy to get drawn in and caught up in like someone who is selling themselves well but is feeding you misinformation. And when people call out that misinformation and you are trying to do your best to learn, it can be really hard. And yeah, like that what someone said there is it's a good point that not all vets will let you film their like exams, which is true. So that's fair. With that said, once you have the exam, they have to release you the images. If they've done any imaging, you can get sent the slides and you can share those. They have to. They are yours. You paid for them. So you might not be able to actually film the exam as it is happening, but every diagnostic from the exam, you can request all of that information and it is yours to give to anyone as you so please. So that would be the other thing is like I understand that you can't always film the exam because not all vets want that. And I do understand like for privacy on their sake and whatnot, like it's important to like respect that. But like when once you get the diagnostics, they're yours to release as you see fit. And yeah, like I think also like when you have a channel like that, if you're willing to release images, it's a really good educational aspect. Like um I don't know, like, I never shared, like, George's full necropsy because when a horse, like, actually dies, like, that's a little bit more personal, and I definitely didn't wanna do it after. I did share it with friends, but I, like, went over, like, the basics of it on my Instagram because it's interesting stuff that I think isn't important for a learning aspect, but, like, obviously, there's that certain level of privacy involved that people should consider. But I do hope that like the vet actually had a reason to start ultrasounding and x-raying stuff because if the horse truly flexed down everywhere and the vet saw no lameness, then I would be kind of concerned that they were being taken for a bit of a ride in that aspect too. But I wanted to bring up the issues with Milo and myself because like I can relate to how it feels to have people like criticize you and say certain things. And honestly, sometimes people are not correct and you are doing everything you can and like and sometimes people can be hypercritical, but like in a case like this, if the horse did pass a lameness exam with no issues without a rider on, then that would be where I would say you should do a ridden lameness exam because some lamenesses will only show up under saddle. And then if you do that, you can start to rule out if it's the tack that's causing it, if it's the rider that's causing it, or if it's just the sheer active packing weight around that's causing it. Um, like for Milo's lameness issues when he had his ulcer bout and then had a flare up with like his weaker stifle, I had to do a ridden lameness exam because the lameness on the ground was like basically imperceptible. You couldn't see it. And it was so slight that it looked like I was just talking about nothing. And then I was like, okay, like, no, they're like there is something going on. He's not being himself. So we did a ridden lameness exam. And it's basically the same as a regular lameness exam where you usually typically start out with like lunging them loose, they watch them jog, but then you tack them up and you get on the horse and you go walk, trot, canter, like all the way around the arena on a circle, transitions, etc. And they get a way better comprehensive idea of what is actually going on with the horse because honestly like even with a regular lameness that you can see when there's no one there, if it's a very minor lameness, doing a ridden lameness exam can allow the vet to actually see the full scope of the issue and it might help them in further identifying what it is without having to pay to do a ton of different diagnostics. Like if it's kind of up in the air which leg it might be and you've done blocks and it's a little bit inconclusive, a ridden lameness exam can kind of make or break that. So it's never a bad idea to do one. And like a lot of lameness vets would suggest that. And like that's what I had to do with Milo with his lameness because it was subtle and it was like the lack of willingness to go forward that was like much worse under saddle, which makes sense because like when you have ulcers and like acid splash where my leg would be and with like the extra weight on his stifle and stuff, um, it showed up more under saddle. And yeah, and, like, that would also be a concern too for, like, looking at, like, if a horse, like lameness can show up due to, like and it can look like it's within the limbs, even if it's, like, a back lameness, and, like, obviously, if a horse's back sore and they have, like, kissing spine or something, they will probably look more lame when they are packing weight because they are packing weight on the affected area and having to compensate for that, and then that's where you might see limb lameness show up because the horse is trying to compensate for the fact that their back is sore. And like there's a lot of different things and also like lameness doesn't necessarily need to be that bad or it doesn't even need to be lameness. If it's just a behavioral issue, it's still something where I think people should look at it and go like why is this behavioral issue existing? How can I lessen it? What can I do to make the horse happier and more comfortable? And those are 3 things you can do while still actively working your horse and doing stuff with them. So if they're sound and they have something come up that's a little bit weird, those are things that you can totally do while still working your horse. And it's just all it requires is to just get a little bit curious about why is this happening? Why is this occurring? especially if it's something that's like specific to a specific rider or saddle or something. Like the more curious you get and the more you actually make the effort to try to look at like what the commonalities are between the behavior, it is something that will help you put together the full picture and address it. And it also helps people avoid a lot of like injuries and safety issues because honestly, like a lot of people that have the biggest problems with their horses are like endangering themselves and like getting into situations where they can get hurt. A lot of it is like underlying issues with horses who have behavioral problems or lameness. And then those problems come out because of the horse's discomfort. And yeah, like, it keeps people safer, and I don't know, like, I've spent way more money, in past years, like, when I was younger and, like, in my teens, my horses would have had to suffer through a lot more bullshit than they do now. Because now I'm, like, making more of an effort to try to find out why they do things and, like, literally taking it to the point where I'll watch videos in slow motion and, like, watch to see, like, if they're landing, like, at the same like, if they're, like, uneven, even, like, a slight unevenness at the hind leg where they're tracking up slightly differently. It's something that, like, even if the horse isn't clinically lame, you take that knowledge and you put it in your back pocket and you just keep it there to be mindful of something. Because then if other stuff starts to come up, it's like you already have certain things that you've noticed that you can then link together to help a vet out or help another professional out if something happens. Um, and, like, again, with my horse, like Milo, like, he's fat, he's coming back into work after having had time off due to being uncomfortable. So, he has some associations with riding now because he was uncomfortable, especially when I had to ride him for the lameness exam and stuff because, like, that was one of the situations where it's like you can't really say no because you need to do this right now for the greater good of, like, your health because the vet needs to see you move forward. And it gave him a more negative association with riding because he was uncomfortable. And I was like, no, you have to go and do this. And he's like, why? Why are you making me do this? So now I'm having to counter condition all of those behaviors. And I also, this is why this is kind of the horse industry talk for this live because I wanted to talk a little bit about this because I was talking to like my therapist about it the other day. And it's something that's really hard for me to talk about. So I'm going to try to like do this in the best way possible. But I was talking to her about like horse training and like some of the misgivings I have with the industry and like how my training has changed over the course of years and why. And like what I was talking to her about is like the differences that you see like having started Milo how I did. Like I got Milo when I was just like he was what caused me to start breaking into like the whole science-based training and like rewards-based training. Like I wasn't really doing it before him. And I was talking to my therapist about comparing Milo to Banksy and how sad it is for me to see the differences in their level of willingness to actually want to participate and enjoy the work simply because of how differently they were started. And it's not even like Milo would have been like heavily abused in training. I just would have been harsher on him than I would have been on Banksy. And I went about things in a different, more demanding and aversive way from the beginning because that's what I knew how to do. And it has altered how he responds to things. And in order to counter condition those responses now, I have to work way harder. It's like doubled or tripled my work because he has that previously negative association with certain things so I didn't go about them the best way. And it was something that was really upsetting for me to talk about to her. And it's easier now because I've gotten it off of my chest already once. But I was like crying because I was like, I have so much guilt for how I went about things with Milo in the beginning, and it's stuff that I can't take back. So now when I go online and I share these things, people may take it as me trying to like attack them, but realistically it's me trying to save them from like the long-standing guilt and sadness that I've experienced, like especially when it's right in front of you like it is with me because since I've raised Banksy from birth and primarily trained him using rewards-based methods, it's a very stark like you can basically see the line drawn in the sand based on their different responses to things. And I don't know if there's a way to like get it that much painted out in front of you how differently the brain compartmentalizes different types of training. Because with Milo, like Milo still like he likes to come out and work and do certain things, but for like even just getting him to target train and do it without too much frustration, it took a lot of repetition and like a lot of little baby steps and a lot of patience to get him to the point to be a willing participant. Whereas Banksy, who has basically been taught from the beginning, like, hey, if you want to work, there's going to be a reward for it. He's eager to go out. He shoves his head in the halter. He marches into the arena. Like Banksy's only real behavioral issue that annoys me is when I try to take him back to the field, he doesn't want to go back. He would rather stay in the arena and work. Like and like that's the antithesis of what I see in horses who have been trained similarly how I started Milo, where you turn them towards the arena and they don't want to go into the arena because they're like, this is hard work. I don't like it in there. And seeing that difference painted out in front of you when you have two horses and also having to like reconcile with the feelings of like, obviously for me, I find working with Banksy more reinforcing and more fun than Milo because he enjoys it more and it's less stressful and hard for me because with Milo, I'm still counter conditioning a lot of stuff to make him the type of horse that I see Banksy being already. So I enjoy working with Banksy more and that makes me feel more guilty because it's not Banksy's fault. I mean, it's not Milo's fault that Banksy enjoys training more because he's having more of a reason to enjoy it. And it's a really like that's kind of where like I see the industry. We're at like this flipping point where like once you start to see things a certain way, you can't unsee them. And it causes like it's hard because it forces you to self-reflect to a large degree. And it forces you to like completely like reconsider things and how you used to do them. And it can be uncomfortable, but also I think it's important to talk about because like it doesn't get talked about enough. And I see a lot of people just like being perpetually frustrated with horses and mad about the problems they have when the problems the horse has are created by the training program or the management program that the horse is in. And then you have a horse who's frustrated, you have a rider who's frustrated, and no one is enjoying themselves. So that's like a huge problem in the industry, and a lot of our frustrations with horses we actually create through how we handle them. And I think like this is obviously easy to say because we haven't seen it applied on a large scale, but like the amount of like motivation and like excitement to work that can be created through rewards based training is like it's not comparable whatsoever to the traditional like aversive style training. And I still use negative reinforcement. This is not shitting on all types of traditional training. It's just saying that like from a psychological perspective, the amount of power and motivation that is behind actually motivating an animal or a person or like anyone, actually motivating them to want to do what you're asking, the amount of power that gives you as a trainer to then model behavior is astronomical. It's not even comparable. Like trying to force an animal to do something that they don't want and that they don't see value in is always going to be more work than if you can actually motivate them to want to do it for you. And I think that the best training is actually making the creature want to do the thing because then it's like easy. And it's way more fun to watch because they're more fun to work with. And it all starts with like undoing these biases that were learned and taught and like entrenched in from a young age because like for in the beginning when I started to go science-based methods, I was way more defensive when people suggested different ways of doing things or called pressure and release aversive. It had like a visceral response where it would make me feel like angry and upset and I'd get defensive. And like here's the thing, pressure and release has to be aversive. Like from a reinforcing standpoint, it has to be reversive. Otherwise, if you remove the pressure, it would not be reinforcing because if the horse liked the pressure and found pressure to be enjoyable and rewarding, removal of it would actually be punishing. So that is the key that I think a lot of people need to understand about this type of training is that like calling pressure and release aversive doesn't mean that you're causing your horse like exponential levels of stress. Like if you do non-escalating pressure and release, it might just be a little bit irritating. Like if someone's tapping on your shoulder like this, you'll probably look because you'd probably prefer that they stop tapping. And it can be just like that. But the important factor is that in order for the removal of the pressure to be reinforcing, it has to in some way be aversive if that's like your only like reinforcer. And I couldn't like because I'd been so strongly discouraged from like when I started riding. And again, this is another thing that I talked about my therapist with. And she asked me, she said, Shelby, how long were you riding and taking lessons the traditional way and training in the way that you now don't love as much? And I like thought about it and I was like, okay, like at least 14 years, like from age 4 to 18, 14 years. And she's like, okay, and how long have you been like practicing more science-based methods and really like starting to like encourage them in your program and like actually have it be a full part of your program? And I was like 4 or 5 years. And then she was like, okay, so you have 14 years and you have 5 years that you've been doing something else. So you can imagine how hard it is to make that shift and to really start to pull your mindset away and have that epiphany when you've had 15 years or like however many years you've had of people literally drilling stuff into your head. And the way it's drilled into your head from those types of people, like for me at least, and from what I've heard from other riders, it's not much different. Is like I like from a young age 4, never feed horses from your hand. If you feed them from your hand, they will bite you and get mouthy. If your horse bites you, you got to pop them in the mouth. Otherwise, they will bite you more and they will be bad. If a horse is pushy, they need to be put in their place. Otherwise, they will be bad and take advantage of you. And basically, if the horse says no, you got to show them who's boss and make them do it. You got to make them work. They're trying to get out of work. You got to make them do it. No, they're not scared. They've seen that thing in the arena before. Make them do it. And it's drilled in your head and again and again and again, especially from a young age. Because like as a kid, I would have tried feeding horses by hands, but I would have been punished for it. I would have had trainers walk up to me and be like, hey, like, don't do that. You're going to make the horse mouthy. Never hand feed a horse. Or if a horse bit me and I didn't hit them, the trainer would then come up, pop the horse in the mouth and be like, you need to get after the horse, or they're going to walk all over you. This isn't how it flies here. Or if you refuse to smack your horse with the whip when they refuse, the trainer will then yell and berate you until you do it. And slowly over time, over like the course of like a decade or more, this can condition it into being your first response to certain things, because it starts to become an innate trained response. And the kinder way of doing things is actually something you're heavily discouraged from doing by a lot of these trainers. So you're taught to have an aversion to the kinder way of doing things, but then freely dish out punishment without actually considering why and how you do it. And it's such a powerful means of conditioning these behaviors in people that like it's to the point where like when you meet people who've been trained this way, they can love their horses. They might not even be overly rough horse people, but when they've been taught the only way to handle certain bad behaviors that they don't want is through punishment or through doing stuff in this traditional manner, they just do it freely because it literally doesn't even cross your mind that there's another way of doing things. Your horse bites you while you're talking to a friend, you just pop them in the mouth like that, and it's such a like not like you don't even think about it. It's such a normal reaction through how you've been taught over the course of years and constant repetition that breaking those habits is actually very hard, and undoing like the brain pathways that lead you to thinking in such a rigid way that leads you to like denying science. It is really, really hard to do. And that's why I wanted to do this live, because I think that a lot of the time it's oversimplified, and like even people on the side where they're trying to encourage science-based practice and be like more rewards based, there's a certain level of perfectionism that is demanded that I think is a problem, because I think that we need to normalize the idea like that, like our horses, a lot of us have been trained and entrenched in certain methods and like punished if we don't do them, so that you start responding and using those methods as second nature. And when you start to make the shift to kinder methods and start to want to let go of those methods, then if you absent-mindedly punish or handle something in a way that you would have used to before, it's accompanied with this horrendous guilt when you do it, because now that you know that it's the not the best way to do things, you feel bad when you do it, but also there's that certain level of like absent-mindedness to training because you're just used to handling things in a certain way. So it requires a lot of untraining and like retraining yourself and reframing how you think in order to let go of that. And I don't think that enough people talk about that, because like it's the same thing with how we respond to like anything in society. Like if you've been trained to believe that something is the way it is and that there's no other way and that this is just fact and that this is the way things have always done, this is just the way it is, then you stop questioning if there's another way of doing things. And when I first started to get into rewards based training, I literally thought that when people said like, oh, like don't train with pressure and release, that they were saying like I train with positive reinforcement. I don't use any pressure on my horse ever. Like no pressure at all, no tactile pressure, all pressure is bad. And then I was like, okay, like wait, hold up. You don't like, so are you just like mind controlling your horse then? Like what? Excuse me? No, like there's not all pressure is aversive. Not all pressure is aversive. If all pressure was aversive, horses couldn't even groom each other because it would be aversive. You can train horses to respond to pressure-based cues without actually teaching it with an initially aversive association. And that was a groundbreaking discovery that like when it finally clicked in my head, I was like, oh my God, I've been so stupid. Like I've been completely missing the point. The point's constantly going over my head. And then when I finally got it, I was like, okay, like so you can teach pressure cues without having it be trained in an aversive manner. And it's totally possible to do. And then the horse can start responding to it the same way as what they would if they weren't trained with non-escalating pressure. And once you get comfortable, like, admitting, like, what you've done wrong and when you've gone wrong and, like, where you've gone wrong in training, it's honestly really empowering, and that's why I like talking about this type of stuff because for so long, I was so defensive, never wanted to be wrong, never wanted to admit when I'd done something wrong, really, like, and, like, to still to today, like, I have a very hard time, like, not being like, at anything I do, like, it's hard for me to like enjoy something without having it consume me about trying to be like the best I can at it and like learning how to be the best and learning the most I can even with hobbies. Like it's hard for me to enjoy something without without feeling like a failure if I'm not the best, you know? And like with writing that was really hard for me is admitting that I had been taught a lot of stuff wrong when I'd been writing for so long because that's admitting that like you don't know as much as you think and that was a really scary thing to admit. But when you realize how empowering it is to be like, yeah, I did that wrong, then you start to do it more because it takes away all the power from people who would weaponize those things to try to discredit you. So, for example, if someone comes up to me and be like, well, you used to do, blah, 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 blah," and I'm like, yeah, I did, and that was stupid and wrong, which is why I'm not doing it anymore. What argument do they have now? They're gonna what they can go off and be like, well, you did it. And it's like, okay, like I did it and I've admitted I was wrong and I've changed now. So like that's that on personal growth. Like, why are we like glorifying the idea of sticking to your guns to the extent where you're going to choose ignorance over fact because you're that rigid on your beliefs? Like that's basically what a lot of the horse world encourages is being so rigid in your stance that like you're just like no, like I'm not open to anything. And like it's been really empowering to like unlearn that tactic and like there are things that I'm rigid on now but it's for a different reason. Like I'm really rigid on like my views on turnout and stuff, but it's because of the information behind it. Like if studies suddenly came out that are like, oh, horses love stalls and there's no problem with stalls, and they had more factual evidence than everything on the other side, then my opinion would change with that, but that's obviously not going to happen. And yeah, so it's important to be able to like recognize the mistakes you've made and not be like afraid of like admitting where you went wrong because I think that that's like one of the things that holds a lot of people back from changing. It's really empowering to do that because it takes away power from people who would use the stuff you've done wrong as a reason to discredit and like make fun of you and put you down. If you start owning your shit and admitting that like yeah, I did that wrong, it's like suddenly people don't have as much to hold over you. And it also in turn makes what you say and what you suggest, like when I'm sharing stuff about positive reinforcement, I've noticed that people are way more receptive to it when I look at my old riding photos and footage and criticize myself. They are way more receptive to listening to what I have to say because it makes them feel less attacked because I'm not actually attacking them. I'm attacking my old self and heeding a warning through the footage of themselves basically. And like with highly abusive stuff, yes, I do attack people, but like I would say that's different. If you're going to post a video of you like beating the shit out of a horse with like a branch or like yeah, endangering them, then you kind of deserve to have people come at you a little harder. But Shelby, have you used food rewards under saddle yet? Yes. So for starting horses under saddle, this is another thing that I think that people really need to consider for positive reinforcement. Like honestly, like the traditional way of like teaching like leg aids of where you just keep adding pressure until the horse responds and moves off of it. It costs so much more energy expenditure from the trainer when you could literally just target train the horse and then pair the forward leg cue with them following the target. And honestly, I've started to notice a lot of those things where it's like when I was training the like traditionally and like only using pressure and release and working with horses who were scared and didn't want to work with me and not making it rewarding for them at all, I was like always out of breath, always tired, always frustrated, and like always having to apply myself physically more because I'd have a horse who's actively trying to get away from me and not wanting to do what I'm asking it to do because like there's nothing in it for them. And I was always more frustrated and pissed off. And now, like with certain behaviors, it's so much more relaxed because you're literally just chilling in the arena with like a bag of food, and the horse actually wants to hang out with you. Like, if you let them go, they're going to stay with you. They're not trying to get away from you. And they're actually wanting to explore things that they might be a little afraid of because they trust you. And you're not having to freaking like be like kick, 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 whip, crop, swap, 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 spur. because you're like, hey, like, this is a target. Do you want to follow it? And the horse is like, yeah, I do. I get a cookie when I touch that. Awesome. And then you're like, great, I'm going to put on this leg cue right when you take that step and add a little cluck, the vocal cue. And then soon it will be the cue for that behavior. And you can start taking the target away once they have it down. And it takes away all of that frustration of having to be like thumping on a horse, especially horses that aren't super sensitive. Like if you get like a draft horse that doesn't really care if you're like squeezing with your legs, getting them to move without being like a total dick to them when you're only trying to use pressure and release can be hard because they aren't overly bothered by the pressure and they can ignore it and tune it out. And then you have to put in way more physical effort. And I think that's one of the biggest things I've noticed for myself is that I'm less stressed. And like when I do start getting really stressed in training and feeling really bad about myself, it's usually because I'm working with clients who aren't as on board with what I do. And then that can be really hard to navigate too. But like part of doing my job is trying to make my methods of training more like acceptable to those types of people so that they can then kind of take that and go like, wow, this works. And like I've had a lot of people enter my program and like start disrespecting me right away because they just don't like how differently I do things from them, and I think it makes them feel targeted and attacked. But then when they start seeing the different ways of doing things working, you really start to see how quickly they backpedal and like go like, okay, like I'm actually open to this. And then they start using like little things and adding it to their toolbox, and that's kind of how it grows. Like I view like horse training kind of the same way as I would with like anyone who's like it, like if you want to be a vegetarian or a vegan, or if you're like trying to do stuff whatever you can to be more sustainable, like you can't punish people for not being the most sustainable or not being the most vegan or not being the most positive reinforcement purist, you know? Like you can't punish, like you shouldn't be punishing anyone who isn't like 100% of the way there, because then basically you're saying like you still suck until you're perfect. Like you have to kind of be like, yay, thank you for trying this. Like any effort you're making to do better and be kinder to your horse is still an effort that a lot of people aren't making for their horses. So that's another thing that I think riders need to consider when you feel stuck and feel like you're trapped, especially if you lease or ride lesson horses and you don't get a lot of say. It can feel exhausting and you can feel trapped in a situation that you can't control, but it's important to consider the fact that like every little thing you do to try to make the life better for the horse and to try to better yourself as a rider is still a positive payoff to some horse. Like it might not change their life completely, but it's going to make their life better than it would have been if you hadn't been making those efforts. And I think that's what people need to consider is you don't need to be perfect to be making an effort, but I do think it's important to try to be the best that you can be and to continue improving yourselves, because it's way too easy to stagnate and get into things that are like the easy way out at the expense of your horse, and to be really put off by other ways of doing things that seem different and scary. It's really easy to sink into your comfort zone and not want to change. And it's really hard to break free of that. But like any effort you're making to educate yourself and be better in any way is still an effort being made. And I think that clarification is important because also, like, with how hard I go on welfare issues and with how firm some of my stances are, people take that as me being unable to get along with anyone who doesn't think like me. And that's really not the case. Most of the horse people that I'm friends with and that I hang out with on a regular basis and that I surround myself with are nowhere near as science based or positive reinforcement based as I am. They don't typically even have the same views on turnout. Like, we are different. However, we can coexist. We can respect each other. I can respect the steps that they take to make their horses' lives better. And I don't have to agree with everything that they do, but it doesn't mean that everything has to be a fight. Like, they know where I stand on things. I'm not going to go out of my way to start fights with random people for no reason in my personal life if I can't like immediately change their horse's situation. Like, if I have people in my personal life who don't believe in horse turnout, the way I handle it is just by freaking writing my own post on like horse ethology and like turnout and management and stuff, and sharing information that's not directed at them and just putting it out there and hoping it comes across their page. And that's kind of how I handle it with like day-to-day people. And like I've had people bring it up a lot because I work in the racing industry too, which is like a relevant point because a lot of people are against racing and they don't like the age the horses are started at and whatnot. And I totally get that. But also at the same time, racing isn't going anywhere. And like it is an industry that could be done super well if people push for more ethicality, but I think a lot of those changes need to come from the inside because people need to see that different methods work. And since racing is such a different industry and there's not a whole lot of people who have views like me in that industry, they do need people like me to kind of slowly start spilling our way in and showing them that stuff works. And I've had a lot of success with racehorse trainers sharing what I think and like what I want to try and what I think might work for their horses and having them actually be receptive to it. And while there might still be things within the program that I don't agree with, it is really still beneficial to the horses that I'm working with because I'm making changes that are then making their trainer more open-minded and also helping the horses that I'm sitting on. Like, for example, the trainer that I've worked with the most in racing, she's now retiring, unfortunately. So, like, not working for her anymore, but she's incredible, very open-minded, very research-minded, and was like looking into research on like conditioning youngsters and like taking science into account for how she conditioned her young horses. And we had a couple horses in particular that when she had them, like, they started having issues with the bit, out on the track. Like, they weren't bolting or anything, they were just kinda, like, head tossing and just, like, a little uncomfortable, and I mentioned the fact that I thought that they might be losing teeth, and I asked her, like, "Hey, like, since we're at home, this is a private track, would you mind if I tried them bitless? Like, if they run off on me, it's my ass on the line, like, who cares, right?" And she was open to it. A lot of trainers would have said no to this. She let me. The horse went spectacular bitless, so he trained bitless until his teeth were lost, and then we transitioned him back to a snaffle. And like that's just one example of like a little change that you can make where you're slowly opening people's minds simply from being in the industry. And like I don't agree with like running horses at 2, and I think that there's probably in theory better ways of doing this. However, like on the science side of things, there is some science that does show that horses who are trained lightly at 2 hold up to running better. However, like that doesn't necessarily mean they need to pack the weight of a rider to develop that bone remodeling. But like there is some science on that side. And also like I don't have to fully agree with every aspect in every industry to be part of it. Because like realistically, how many industries are there that we're in complete agreement with? So I would like to see some changes happen in horse racing, but I also think that simply by being involved and developing the connections I have and sharing my beliefs and talking to people, that I'm actually making positive change that wouldn't be able to happen otherwise. Because if I wasn't around and if I wasn't there to hear their stories and be a part of the industry and show my love for the thoroughbred horse, they would not trust what I say. They wouldn't. And I wouldn't be respected because they wouldn't know that I can work with the horses how I can. When people see me going out on their horses and able to get along with them and suggesting kinder ways of doing things and not being so quick to like use the whip on them or get mad at them and stuff. Like when I was gate schooling horses, which I've not done in large excess because mostly I've worked at a private farm, but like last year when I was at the racetrack gate schooling horses, or no, 2020, summer 2020, I didn't want to use a whip. And a lot of times I didn't even bring a whip down with me. It is very taboo to not bring a whip down on like a 2-year-old, especially when you're gate schooling them because they get nervous, obviously. And I got in trouble a couple times for getting one. And like when I did have to bring one, like if the trainer would make me bring one, I would literally just hold it and I would talk to the gate crew. And I like the gate crew is pretty good to me, and I had good babies that didn't have bad problems. But like I was like, okay, like can you give them a second to just like look at the gates from here and then like go slowly, like petting them, like sitting in the gates and stuff and like chilling and make it a good experience. And it's like, yeah, like sure, like in a perfect world, I wouldn't be getting on a 2-year-old, but also like if I'm the one on it and I can control how fast they're going, I can control how fast they slow down, I can control how fast they're going around the turns, and I can do everything I can to protect them, it's a better situation than if someone else were to be there doing it. And that's kind of the way I view things. Like if I ever get the opportunity to own my own property, I would love to get into racing from the standpoint of like raising my own racehorses and training them how I think they should be trained and see how it goes, because then it would give me the means of actually seeing whether or not my ways would achieve success in the racing world. And if they did, then that would further prove to racehorse people that different ways of doing things work. But unfortunately, with how expensive racing is, it's not cost effective for me to get a racehorse. And I wouldn't be able to control things to the degree that I would want to if I was the owner of the horse without actually having my own property to keep and raise the horse at. And right now, I just don't have the space for it. But that would be a goal of mine in the future to do because I think it's important. Like you kind of have to practice what you preach and show people that it's possible to make these changes in order to have them be open-minded and receptive. And also like on the flip side, for a lot of people who hate horse racing, very like most of them are not involved at all in racing. Like their involvement is like choosing what they want to see and like generally probably fixating on the bad stuff and not actually sitting down to like hear like what people who are involved think and feel. And I think that also makes it a lot easier to vilify everyone and make them out to be heartless people who don't care about their horses if you're not making any effort to get to know the very people you're judging. And like, that's not to say that you should have to go work for like abusive horse trainers, but like I think that it would do people a service before they say boycott all racing to go out to good racing farms and talk to good racehorse trainers and spend a day in those barns. And they probably still won't agree with everything, but it'll give you a different perspective. Because even for me, like if I had started out in racing with a worse trainer, it would have really poisoned my perspective on racing, and I probably would have been anti-racing. My view is such because I had such a good role model who really did care for her horses, and she had such a large string of horses that like I was riding all the time. And like having worked for her and then also for other trainers, it's allowed me to actually compare her level of success in terms of how sound and happy her horses were to other people's barns. And it was pretty profound to see the difference because like I saw a very low instance of stress behaviors in her barn, and most of the horses who developed them had already had them before they'd gotten to her barn. Like all of the babies that she bred were growing up like sound and happy, and she cared about what homes they went to and was like very involved in ensuring that they were happy and sound and not running them too long and all that jazz. And it showed me a perspective that it's like, yeah, like people do care. And if you don't see that perspective, it's easy to pretend it doesn't exist. And like on like a lesser note for like this isn't about horse abuse, but you see the same thing happening with like people's empathy towards each other. Someone who has grown up privileged and never known what it's like to not be able to afford the things that they'd like to do and to not have barriers in front of them when they're making decisions like what school to go to, what sports to do, and all that jazz. Like people without those barriers are less likely to empathize with people who have tons of barriers and financial issues if they don't actually take the time to understand them and learn about their struggles. And this is also why it's so easy for like politics and stuff to ignore the struggles of other people, because if you never have divergent people coming from different backgrounds sitting at the table sharing their experiences, you're not going to learn how to consider those experiences because to you, they either don't exist or they exist in very small quantities because you're surrounded by people who don't experience those problems. And then it's really easy to ignore them as issues. And we see that happen in the horse world a lot, like on both sides. For like the good side, where people are trying to promote like change in the horse world, it's easy for them to discredit certain um, industries in the horse world as being wholly abusive if they don't see how it could be done properly. And I think that that's kind of the key is like we have to like you can criticize and say where you'd like to see changes in an industry, but in most cases I would say it's not practical to go for a complete boycott, especially with racing that like overall like running in like a mostly straight line when they're not like injured and stuff, if they're sound and if they were like moving the racing age and there weren't like the high instance of injuries that there are now, like or higher compared to other sports. It's like a pretty easy sport to condition a horse to do well and like have it be a very natural behavior to offer. So like I think if racing is boycotted, it's not going to set a good precedent for the rest of the sport because like most other horse sports we have involve a lot more force and like a lot less natural behaviors for the horse. And like yeah, racing has a long way to go. And like honestly, like if we start to see the changes we're seeing in other industries where people adopt kinder tactics, I think we'll see a huge change in the industry overall, because even something as simple as like normalizing the idea of stress behaviors in horses and why they exist and how to address the actual underlying cause of the behaviors, if we normalize that, it'll start to weed out like the number of people who are using stuff like lip chains and like elevator bits and harsher pieces of equipment for regular handling, because they'll start to learn different tactics that are safer and actually result in horses who are easier to handle. And then by default, like the aversive types of equipment that are kind of necessitated now would no longer be needed. And that all starts with people actually having the discussion, and you can't really have the discussion that'll then like help people change and remodel their ways if you go into the discussion with I hate your sport, there's no way to make it ethical, you all suck, I want to ban this sport. No one's going to want to listen to you if that's the case. And Yeah, like, and from what I've seen in racing and other sports, like, the abuses we see are so closely aligned and very similar. The only difference with racing above other sports is because of the speed the horses are moving at, the breakdowns that they have are gonna be more catastrophic by default because, like, if a horse breaks down in, like, the hunter ring or the jumper ring, they're probably still gonna be able to walk off and, like, go into the barn even if they need to get euthanized after. It's never gonna be associated with being, like, directly in the arena or like on the track like with racehorses because it's just not as catastrophic. It's not as high intensity of a sport. So when injuries do happen, they're not going to be to the point where the horse literally needs to get euthanized on site right there in front of everyone. And also other sports aren't covered to the same degree. And like with journalism and stuff with other sports, there's a lot more protections. Like there's very few big show barns that would welcome people to come watch them train every day, whereas at the racetrack, it's public. So you could go and watch the horses train every day and you could be filming people. You can't walk into private sport horse barns and do the same thing. So it leaves a lot more room for those types of barns to be abusive behind the scenes and never have it be brought up to like public eye. And then those types of people get off the hook and they get to redirect the anger to a public industry like racing and be like, oh, well, what about the racehorses? And it lets themselves off the hook. And yeah, like I would say like racehorses, you get more breakdowns, but like with show jumpers and stuff like that, you could have a chronically lame horse that's just pumped full of injections and is going around jumping when it probably shouldn't be, but like you're not going to see the same level of issue as what you would if it was like a racehorse running on injuries that can't withstand that level of speed. Um, so yeah, like the industry I think like there's a lot of reform needed and I definitely think it's possible, but it's going to start to like we need to just get more imaginative with how we work and train because a lot of the way we've been teaching people is to have no imagination in training and to think that like tradition is the only way of doing things and that because things have been done the same way for so long that that's a reason to keep doing it. And I don't believe that that's a logical stance to take. And I think that it's also damaging to growth because like it I don't know, like there has to be some type of like mutual ground where you can like discuss and not like completely write off the validity of the other side. Like even with me being as open as I am with my training methods and sharing how I teach, I've had a lot of people be like, "Oh, well like you're against negative reinforcement." And I'm like, "Pardon? Like when have I ever said that?" Calling negative reinforcement aversive is just a scientific fact. It's not me having a stance on the ethicality of it at all. It's like literally just how it is defined in science because it has to be, as I explained earlier in this live. So anyone who missed that can watch back. But yeah, don't some show jumpers and hunter jumpers inject horses' joints to prevent lameness? Like I would say definitely more than some. Yeah. It's very common to do injections to the point where like I've even had people suggest that it's like abusive for me to not be injecting sport horses because it's a preventative. Like that's actually a fairly common belief where people think that you're not taking full care of your sporting athlete if they're not having their joints injected, which is absurd. Absurd. And yeah, like I think if we change how we judge things and if people start to change, like if we get enough people that are like wanting to adapt their methods and re-enter the show world and do things in a nicer way, the judging system will inevitably have to change because otherwise they'll have no one to judge. And the more people that get out there and start doing that and start showing people what it looks like and then it's possible, the better. And I would love to see that happen. Because even for me, like I don't know, like we need to reform the horse world from the standpoint of like in show disciplines it is way more common to see like harsh equipment justified and allowed in the rules but then like get softer equipment stigmatized and banned. For example, you can't ride bitless in dressage or the hunter ring, and then in show jumping like you can ride in like the whole kitchen sink really harsh bit setups even at the upper levels, which I think is silly because it's like how well trained is your horse if you can't get into the show ring without causing it like physical distress and immense pain because of the equipment you choose? Like if you can't control your horse, this isn't me saying that like show jumping shouldn't allow bits, but like and like for Andy Kocher, who is now banned for 10 years, go look up some of the bitting rigs he uses. Go look up Danny Waldman or Goldstein or whatever her last name is. Feather Girl. Her bidding rigs are insane. If you need that to get into the arena, I am of the mind that you don't deserve to be there. You don't. There's someone else who deserves to be there more, who has put the work in, who probably cannot afford to be there, that is not there, and could do so in a nicer, kinder way. So, if anything, I think show rules should discourage people from using harsh equipment and allow anyone to use soft equipment. Because, for example, this happened a couple years ago, but like I've ridden Milo bridleless basically everywhere. We've gone through fucking neighborhoods. We've gone on trail rides. We've done mountain trail rides. He's galloped on a racetrack. He's gone everywhere bridleless. I asked Equine Canada show steward if I could compete bridleless in the show jumping ring. Very clear stipulation there. In the show jumping ring. No other horses in the arena with us. No safety hazard other than to me and him. I was told that it was unsafe and I'm not allowed to compete bridleless and that he has to have a bridle. And the show steward literally told me this while in the background I was watching a little like 8-year-old junior rider go careening around on this big warm blood in an elevator bit with its mouth gaping open, flying around, taking off from all distances. Not safe. And I was like, okay, so like we're actually out here pretending that like harsh equipment is safer even when someone is actively demonstrating how it's not. And like, don't get me wrong, if I went into the show ring bridleless and my horse was out of control and was being a danger to himself and me, excuse me. But that standard should apply to anyone, regardless of what equipment is on them. And that's my issue with like how the show world is run, is because you're literally made to feel like you can't participate in it if you want to be softer. Like there's rules to stop you from being too soft, but then there's rules that necessitate harshness in certain chances. Like if your horse has an oral injury and doesn't like wearing a bit, you're kind of fucked for dressage. You can't ride at dressage. And then even more so, if your horse goes excellently in a snaffle, doesn't matter. As soon as you get to a certain point in dressage, if you want to keep climbing the levels, you need a double bridle. Why? Why? Why is that? And also, like, I would argue that the more equipment someone needs, the less they are in control, because you wouldn't need to use harsh equipment on the off chance your horse just decides to bulldoze through your aids if you were truly in control. And like like obviously not everyone's going to be, you can't be in control of a 1,200-pound animal all the time, but it doesn't depend on the type of equipment you have. If you've built better rapport with your horse and you're not trying to force them through everything, then you're probably not as likely to lose control ever in a dangerous manner, because even if your horse gets upset, they're more likely to come back and listen to you. Like I could literally turn Milo loose at the beach and he wouldn't go anywhere. He might go wandering. If he's spooked, he might run like a couple 10 meters or something, but he's going to come back to me because I'm a safe person. He's not just going to fuck off and go somewhere else. And like that's why like for our shoots and stuff, I can ride him bridleless in the middle of nowhere, because if something happened, I'm not worried about him just leaving, because he will come back to me. And it's a novel concept to horse people to consider that, because they don't consider the fact that an animal, like a flight animal, could be that well trained and they're probably used to their horses running away from them. But like you can't, like, I don't know, the more you weaponize equipment and try to force your horse to participate, like the less control you're in, because all it takes is for that horse to finally get to the point where they say like a really hard no. And then once they say that, you're in really bad danger. And that's the key marker of the issues in the horse world, is just the fact that you're made to feel like a piece of shit for wanting to be kinder or softer, but then we're like literally encouraging children to hit their horses and reef on their horses' mouths right from the time they start riding. And like that is a huge problem. Like why is it that like we're calling people who want to use rewards based methods delicate little flowers, tree huggers, like pansies, like, oh, you're just gonna give your horse a cookie for being bad, or like, oh, like a bitless rider, you tree hugger? Why are we using that language to describe someone who simply just wants to be softer to their horse by their own choice? Like most of these people in doing that aren't even judging anyone else. They just want to do that for themselves, and we're judging them and making fun of them for wanting to be kinder and for being more empathetic. That is wild to me. It is more accepted in the horse world to be malicious and cruel towards your horse and to blame your horse for stuff and to take out your anger or inability to control your horse on the horse itself. But then you are going to get judged and made fun of for being more considerate, because people view it as like tree hugging and like pathetic. And it's like I don't know any situation I can think of where it's actually a fault to have empathy other than feeling shittier yourself because you're surrounded by people who lack empathy. Um, I don't know. And like that's a huge problem that needs addressing in the horse world. Like the show jumping thing pisses me off. Like I can't stand the amount of bits in the show jumping industry. And like show jumping again, same thing as racing. It's a simple enough sport that like if there was better regulations to actually make sure people were in control of their horses and weren't using equipment as a band-aid for control, you could have a really beautiful sport that's like pretty like natural as far as horses go. Like obviously jumping like 5 feet isn't natural, but like it could be way better. But like show jumping is where it is, and like because of the equipment we allow. Like I read an article recently, I think Heels Down magazine posted it, about like the lower level jumpers, and it was kind of talking about the mindset of how you should start in the hunter ring first in order to learn how to be a good jumper. And I find that a little bit silly because it's like you can learn how to ride properly by riding properly at home and like doing flat work and putting the work in so that your horse is in control and not bolting at fences. And that has nothing to do with the hunter ring at all. Like obviously you can't careen around the hunter ring and be successful. So like yeah, that would force people to slow down. But like you don't need to enter a different division and class in order to get your horse going around in a way that would be safer and more beneficial and to rider horse and rider in the jumper ring. And I think that like saying more people need to start in the jumper and equitation ring kind of misses the point that it's like the rules of show jumping itself and how these classes are run are what are enabling people to ride that way. And by not addressing the source of the problem, you're just kind of deflecting blame and not actually seeing it for what it is. And yeah, that's one of my biggest misgivings about show jumping because it's like one of my favorite sports, but it's so hard to like watch and see all these horses that are like really talented athletes, but they'd probably be even more talented if they could actually like think and be piloted around without constantly having like something reefing on their mouth and pull, and like while having their mouth strapped shut with like hundreds of different devices. Like I don't know. And like speaking from experience, like people can get offended by this, but like literally the only motivation for me to jump my horse in an elevator bit when I did was to have more control than I did, and without putting extra work in to actually like teach him how to carry himself better and so that I could establish that control. It was easier to just like slap a bit on. And like even with like the low level jumpers and how kids go racing around, they could set certain rules. Like they could do a lot of the lower level classes as optimal time classes to discourage that type of behavior where you're racing around dangerously. Or they could just start fucking buzzing people out. Like, yes, it's a timed class, but if you're riding dangerously, it doesn't matter if you're winning, you know, like it like buzz people out for riding dangerously. If they're not in control, or if they're putting like trying to place above the well-being and safety of themselves and their horse, kick them out. Like don't enable them in continuing that type of behavior. Like it's like they're in charge of the rules. So it's weird to put it on the people to the extent of being like, oh, like you should start in a different arena to avoid this problem. And it's like, no, the problem exists in the show jumping arena because it is allowed to exist in the show jumping arena. The reason why you see less of this problem in the hunter arena is because there's standards that have been taken to discourage that. And obviously hunter is bad because a lot of people drug their horses and do weird shit like lunging the crap out of them to try to prevent that. But like there's steps that can be taken to discourage that type of stuff. And even with like the drugging and lunging, they could crack a harder line down on that and start kicking people out of like warm up arenas after certain time limits and stuff and actually doing it. Because like the stewards say that they're there to do that, but like there's certain training barns and people in specific that are like literally immune to consequence. And it's really sad. So yeah. Yeah, like I think that like just normalizing bitless riding and allowing it in all sports is something that like they need to do first, because like who the fuck cares if you want to ride bitless? And like I don't agree with the notion that you need a bit to have proper connection in dressage, because like proper connection comes through the top line and back and the core, not from the mouth. But with that said, like if someone's horse is not properly connected, it doesn't matter if they're riding bitted or bitless, just pin them lower. Like that's really all it should be. And yeah, like those same rules could apply because you're not allowed leverage bits in dressage. So like no hacks, like you could just use side pulls or different types of bitless bridles. And I do not see why it is like we're in 2022 and it's still a thing where you're not allowed to ride bitless in dressage. It's so dumb. And like I have yet to hear like a valid explanation for it, because it's like this sport also like like 90% of the horse world is competing at the lower levels or not competing at all. So like also like even for like, oh well, like for the higher levels you got to do this, but it's like if someone wants to ride like lower level dressage bitless, who the fuck cares? Because that speaks for most of the horse world. Like, not everyone that's riding dressage wants to fucking go Grand Prix. So, like, we shouldn't care what Grand Prix riders are riding in when we're looking at, like, how to make the lower levels more accessible to different types of riders and also encourage good horsemanship. Because, like, it's not good horsemanship to show your horse in a bit if they go better bitless, just simply because you're not allowed to. Like, and it's not the fault of the person doing it if you're not enabled in like showing in the equipment you'd like to, but like it's just so absurd to me because it's like there's no logic in policing how soft people can be, but then basically having no line drawn for how harsh people can be um in certain like industries. And yeah, like I see what for bridleless riding, like in the warm up arena and stuff, for sure. I think that like they should tell people like if you wanted to ride bridleless, that to do it in the warm up arena, you'd either need like a special card to prove that you're safe, or you'd have to ride in like a bitless bridle in the warm up arena or something. But when you're in the arena by yourself, like I think that they should just let you do it. And if you go in there and you're out of control, buzz you out and be like, yeah, you can't show bridleless anymore. um so that's kind of where I stand on that, because it's like I don't know, like Milo would prefer not to wear a bridle most of the time, and he'd be happier to do so. So I find it weird that shows won't let him do that when he has the capacity to handle himself bridleless in situations that everyone else's show jumpers would be fucking losing their shit in when they're in way harsher tack. And yeah, like I don't know. I have videos of that horse from the beach standing on the beach bridleless as his friend gallops towards and away from him. How many show jumpers do you know that could handle that bridleless, let alone with their actual equipment that they show in? I don't know any. Like I don't know any like there's no horse that I would have felt comfortable sitting on as their friend gallops away from them when I have like virtually no control, because most horses would try to go. And like we haven't shown in a few years. If I take him back to a show, I'm gonna try again and talk to the steward, because I've gotten permission at schooling shows to do it. But schooling shows aren't like sanctioned by Equine Canada. So if he ever goes to a rated show again, then like we'd need to get permission from someone to do it. And like hopefully it's not the same steward, because they basically laughed in my face and I was like, why is this even a laughing matter? Because like seriously, like why is this funny? Like you're watching people reef on their horse's mouth all day in the jumper ring, but it's like funny and pathetic when some person wants to ride their horse bridleless. So weird. But yeah, like that's my bone to pick with the industry. And then also the beginning of this video is the part where I touched on day by day. So for anyone who wants to see that when I end this stream, you can just watch it back. But yeah, so that's kind of where I stand with them. I've not heard from them yet, so we'll see if I do. I hope that they are doing what it takes to better the care for their horse. And yeah, like I don't know. I think that there's a lot of issues in the horse world, and it gets hard to find like good help anywhere, because there's a lot of like professionals that aren't qualified to do what they do, and there's like a limited amount of qualifications and like organizations that offer people the means of getting like a training like credentials. There's not enough of it, and there's also not enough of stress on like learning horse behavior and anatomy, and like also like the correct way of doing things in terms of what is actually best for the horse versus like what is most advantageous to the rider to rush to the end goal. And I think that the desire to rush is a very, very overwhelmingly like huge desire for a lot of riders. Is it's like you're always looking to go to the destination rather than like enjoying the journey there, and the focus is like the destination, the tricks you can teach your horse to do, how much you can do, how high you can show, how high you can jump, and stuff like that. Like it's not the journey to get there, it's about like what can you do to show me right now that you're a good rider, rather than being like, yeah, a good rider is working with the horse that they have at any given point at the pace that they should be without sacrificing welfare in order to achieve more success for themselves as a rider. But the horse world doesn't really value that enough right now. And unfortunately, we have an awful lot of unqualified professionals that are normalizing highly stressed horses as like the normal behavior. And then that makes it hard for people to identify what a stressed horse actually looks like. So then that adds to the whole problem. And it's like a very insidious issue. And I think that like the best way to change it is just by like opening discussion and sharing views and sharing information, because like it is really hard for people to be open to discussing and changing these types of things, because it like when you're getting told something completely different from like a trainer in your day-to-day life that you trust, but then people online are saying something completely different, it's really confusing, and it's a really shitty situation to be in, where you're kind of like bouncing back and forth between opinions, trying to figure out which one to take, and like trying to figure out like who you should trust, because obviously you want to trust the people who you've built rapport with in your personal life and who have taught you what you know. But there isn't any standards of qualifications and understanding for these people. So that's like an important thing to take away from that, is that like there's not really anything stopping from unqualified people from taking advantage of you. And it wastes a lot of time. Like, I'm pissed, honestly. Like, I grieve my younger riding career, because it makes me mad that I spent so many years learning things the wrong way, when if I had gone to a trainer in theory who was more qualified and had taught me things in a more ethical way, I could be way further ahead by now. And it makes me mad that I'm here like after this long in my riding career, having to like basically relearn a lot of stuff and have to change things, and then still being discredited despite having more credentials than virtually like any trainer that I can think of that gets more attention. Like, people like me who get like our behavior certifications and who go to school for equine sciences are not respected by the average show goer. Like, I have a bit more education on horses and how to care for them and train them ethically than like I can't even think of one upper level rider that's at the top right now that has that. So what that means is I'm more qualified to change and enact behavioral change in horses and write like programs for training than any of the people who are setting the standard at the top of the sport. And is there not a problem with that? Like, to be frank, like I've never ridden a Grand Prix horse. I don't know if I could stay on around a meter 60 horse. I would like to the course. I would like to think I can. That aside, it doesn't really matter if I couldn't, because riding a meter 60 course doesn't mean you are doing so ethically. It doesn't mean you can accurately read equine behavior, or that you're training in a way that is most species appropriate to the horse. None of those things are correlated. You can go around and you can make, just because you can make a horse do something that people find impressive doesn't mean it was obtained ethically. And that's kind of the mindset we need to start shifting, because like people use my lack of show experience as a reason to discredit my claims, when showing would literally provide me with absolutely nothing to facilitate me being a better trainer, other than giving me a show record to display to people who value that over actual education, information, and ethical practice. That's all it would give me. Is it would be a card that I could flash to people who would discredit me otherwise. And it would also give me the means, I guess, to showcase my horses differently from how other people are showing. And that's kind of what my personal motivation is to show, is to be able to show my horses, and like once they're going and doing stuff, and be like, yeah, like look, I'm in the jumper ring in like a leather snaffle or bitless, and like I'm doing this because this is what I believe is ethical. I think any horse can learn how to go in a soft setup like this, and just kind of set the example that I would like to see. That's my motivation to show. But I think it's important to note that like a lot of the most respected upper level equestrians don't really have credentials outside of their show records. And like a show record largely only requires money to enter a show. If you get put on enough nice horses, you are going to get a good show record if you have the money to be there. And having access to nice horses is also very much financially motivated. So for me, if I suddenly won the lottery, I could, in theory, go out and buy like a finished Grand Prix horse, and I could start showing immediately in bigger classes, and could start winning and doing better and getting a show record. But I wouldn't have actually done anything to obtain that other than pay money. And like that, this isn't to say that all of the riders are untalented or only there because of money, but money is such a huge factor in your ability to partake in those types of shows and get that type of attention, that it's not something you can ignore. Like the riders who are there can be good riders, but like we can't lie and be like, oh yeah, it's totally a normal thing for people to be able to drop 30 grand to go down to WEF and show for like a month. And 30 grand's probably on the low end, honestly. Like that's probably way lower than what like a lot of people spend. And like even 1 week at Thunderbird, okay, 1 week at Thunderbird, I haven't gone back in a while, but like $1,500 probably just for stabling in classes. Like I won't stable there anymore. I haul my horses in because I don't want them to be stalled 24/7, and I live close enough to do that. But $1,500, that's how much a lot of people pay for rent for their entire month. So they don't just have the liberty of just fucking throwing that around, especially several times a year, to actually amass the type of show record that people would respect. So the system is so incredibly elitist and against people who come from regular like incomes. Like the average income cannot afford to be there. But there are so many horse people who are in a high income bracket that can, that they then try to normalize their income as being like the new middle class and try to be like, oh, like I just worked really hard to be here. If you work hard enough, you can too. And it's like, excuse me, Sally, your parents bought you a Range Rover for your first car and you've never paid your car insurance or gas a day in your life, and your entire university tuition is paid for. So, with all due respect, I would wager that anyone else who has to like do those expenses themselves, along with holding down the job to pay for them, probably has more barriers to get into the show ring than Sally does. Because even just car insurance, like car insurance in BC is the most expensive in Canada, so I pay a lot for my car insurance. It just went down, but just to like insure my truck to drive on the road is $200 a month just to insure it. That's not including gas, that's not including my truck payment. That is just to insure it to drive on the road. Even just having someone cover that part of my regular payments would be enough where it's like, okay, if someone covered my truck payment, there gives me 200 extra dollars per month to put into a show fund. And $200 a month in the grand scheme of things is very little. So that's just one thing to consider, like the amount of privilege you have is like consider all of the expenses that you do not have to consider if someone else is covering them, or if your family has enabled you in not having to worry them through like giving you like a trust fund or savings, paying for your schooling, or doing like even just doing things to make your life easier. Like there's so many little things that people take for granted that give you the funds and the means of being able to do the things that you like to do because you don't have to worry about putting your own money into other stuff. So that's another thing with the show world that I think needs to be heavily considered is it's not attainable, and like you shouldn't have to sacrifice a ton of basic necessities and like literally sign your soul away just to participate in a sport if that sport is actually accessible. And like what a lot of people claim when they say horse sports are accessible is they'll be like, "Oh, well like if you work hard enough it'll happen." But then the hard work that they're talking about is like, "Oh, you could get a working student position." Okay, great. Let's go look at like the average working student position offered by a farm. Usually it's very hard labor, backbreaking labor, hard work, working with dangerous horses, and you very rarely get back in return what is actually promised. So if you were to actually go and like itemize the amount of hours you had at a working student position versus what you get in return, I highly doubt it would even work out to be minimum wage. I truly believe that most of them are just like it's literally like free labor. Like you're just exploiting people and like saying that you're going to teach them stuff and that they'll learn lots from working for you and that the work itself is knowledge gaining, which it might be in some cases, but even if it is, it's still work. It doesn't matter if they're gaining knowledge while at work. The work is supposed to be helping them get further knowledge and helping them get ahead in the horse sports. And if all of these positions were so great in the way that they're advertised, then why is it that there are so few people at the top of the sport that don't come from money? If all of these positions helps guarantee people a spot at the top, why aren't we seeing more of these kids coming out of these programs and being wildly successful? Because there's a hell of a lot of working student positions out there. We're not hearing from children that are like that have worked them and like making it to the top, not in as large of quantities that you should if they're actually working. And in fact, you hear from more kids who have worked those positions being burnt out and getting out of riding altogether, or really backtracking what their goals were because they've been so mistreated and so burnt out that they're like, I don't even like being around horses anymore. I need a break. And like no one should have to do that. And like the way I see it is like I feel I've worked very hard to get to where I am, and like I'm not it's not me taking away from my hard work to say like, hey, like it would be cool if kids didn't have to work as hard as I did to get the same opportunities, because it was hard enough that I wanted to give up on numerous occasions and I could have, and I persevered and I like was successful, but there was a chance that I wouldn't be. And I don't want, just because I had to go through hardship, for everyone else to have to go through the same thing, because I'm not selfish. Like, just because I suffered doesn't mean everyone else should have to suffer. So long as people understand the suffering of others and empathize with it and don't minimize the struggles of others, great. But like, why would I want someone to have it be as hard as it was for me and have as many barriers as I had, simply because I had them and overcame them anyways? I'd rather take away the barriers and just allow people to enjoy the sport and love the sport without all those extra stressors added. And I think it's really weird that it's so normalized to be like, oh, well, I worked hard, so they should have to. And then the other thing to touch on briefly before I end this live, because I have to go soon, the other thing to briefly touch on is in the US, like they don't have universal healthcare. So even for me as like a trainer and horse person who has gotten on and worked with and ridden dangerous horses, I have done so with the safety net of knowing that if I were to ever fall off and like break my back and need to be hospitalized, that I could go to the hospital and literally be hospitalized for months and not be in medical debt. People in the States doing the same thing don't get that safety net. If you don't have medical insurance, you're working a job with highly dangerous animals for free and risking being in like tens of thousands of dollars of debt if something happens. So that's another thing to consider for the US with these free working student positions. That's even more wild to me, is that these trainers are taking on young riders, endangering them, and giving them nothing in return to safety net them. Like, how many students have gone into working student positions and gotten injuries that resulted in them being unable to continue to work the job, and maybe even unable to ride for lengthy periods of time, and maybe even needed hospital stays, and then they're just fucked. They don't have anything. They have no safety net. No one is there to come help them. And it's just accepted and fine to take on these free positions, even when you literally could get hundreds of thousands of dollars of medical debt from a horse, which is honestly not that far off. Like, horses are dangerous. If a horse steps on and breaks your foot, or if you fall off and break your wrist and you need to go to the hospital, you're going to have to pay for it if you don't have medical insurance. In Canada, if that happened to me, like I broke my hand. I broke my head at a show. Finished riding, went to the hospital, got casted, left. Didn't cost me a dime, didn't get a receipt, never have had to pay at a hospital ever. Never, never. Can just walk in. Just walk in and get seen. So for me, that's not a problem. And even still, in Canada, I would say the working student positions are still exploitive. But like, if you have to pay for your medical debt, what the fuck? You have no money. You can't even save just in case it happens. They're not paying you. So are you in East or West Canada? I'm in Western Canada, like right on the West Coast. So, like, yeah, that's another thing to consider. And head injuries too. Like, head injuries are not taken seriously enough by most horse people. And like, honestly, any type of injury, the amount of injuries I have been encouraged to ride through by trainers for their own benefit is fucked up. And like, again, I get free medical health care. I don't have to pay for it. And yeah, like obviously expenses and taxes and stuff are more expensive here, but like medical debt would be even more so. And like, working with horses is not something you can really fuck around with if you don't have insurance that covers the bills in full. And like, in the US, a lot of insurance doesn't cover the bills in full. So even if you get some of it covered, if you're going to the hospital and having to pay anything for an injury sustained at work, and you're also not getting paid for any time you have to take off or any time that you were working there, that's a huge problem. Like, how are you covering your deductible? How are you covering your time off? How are you feeding yourself? Because I bet a lot of the working student positions, if you were laid up for a while, they wouldn't want you continuing to live in their housing for free. They wouldn't, because they would want to use it for someone who they could squeeze some labor out of. And so, like, it's just like, you shouldn't have to sacrifice that much just to be successful. And the fact that these are the sacrifices people are trying to suggest are reasonable for young riders to make simply to be successful in the horse world is really concerning. And one thing I need people to consider is that the reason, like, the only people who benefit from perpetuating that mindset that hard work conquers all, and that like, if you work hard enough, you'll get where you want, are the people exploiting your hard work. They benefit from making you feel shitty about yourself and you blaming yourself for your lack of hard work not amounting you to where you want to go. They benefit from your lack of self-esteem, your lack of ability to advocate for yourself, and for blaming you for your situation, because it makes you easier to exploit in work. And it makes you more likely to take on labor that is unfair and underpaid, because you're doing so because you think it's the only opportunity that you will get to achieve your dream of being a horse person, whatever your goals are. And yeah, so like those are all things that my dog just sat down on the bed. Those are all things that like play into like this whole like, oh, just work harder. And also like we live in a world where like hard work very clearly isn't compensated fairly. Like I don't know if you guys have ever met like any single mom who works multiple jobs and fucking parents full time. But they work pretty hard and most of them aren't fucking Bill Gates. So I don't know about that. And also like I've met a lot of really hardworking people who have immigrated here from other countries and are thankful to be here, but are definitely being exploited for their labor and working like 80-hour weeks and barely can afford anything. They are hard workers. They're not being compensated fairly for it. In order to try to claim that hard work guarantees success, you'd literally be arguing that like Elon Musk and like Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos are like working like a million times harder than everyone else. And are you really going to suggest that they're working a million times harder than everyone they employ? Like, do we really believe that? If you're working a million times harder than everyone else, you don't have time to go out on your fucking yacht. You don't have time to go and buy multiple houses all over the country. You don't have time to fly places on your private jet because you're fucking working. If they were working way harder than everyone, it would be even more so. Like, how many people do you know that are in the labor force working overtime that have time to go out on vacations and treat themselves to stuff? Not even time, the ability to afford it. But they're not being compensated for their hard work. But even if they were, let's say people working 80-hour weeks were the richest people in the world, they wouldn't have as much time to go out and do all of these nice little freedoms and privileges that the extremely wealthy get to enjoy. And this is not me saying that it's like, oh, let's just like make every like I recognize the world is not a fair place, but I don't view that fact as a reason to not care about trying to make it more fair. I think that that's a cop out. And taking on that mindset basically is just saying like I benefit enough from this current society that I do not give a fuck about anyone but myself. So I don't care. Like that's what that mindset takes on. And like you like even people who can import a horse or buy like even the act of buying a horse who is worth 5 figures, even if you only spend 10 grand, that is $10,000 that a lot of people don't have. And horses are also like outright purchases that you typically can't finance unless you have a line of credit or something. And in order to get a line of credit, you need to have enough credit to actually have one that's worth that amount of money. So buying horses and being able to put a lot of money into horses, and then not only that but also being able to show them, is an immense privilege, and it's not something that hard work gets you. Because if that were the case, there would be a lot of like the barn rat type riders that are at the barn all day working off their lessons and like live breathe horses. You would see those guys in the Grand Prix ring by the dozens if hard work was what got you there, because those kids sacrifice everything to be involved in the barn, and it still is not enough. And unfortunately, those very people who sacrifice like that often get like completely shafted and burnt out and then don't want to ride anymore. So we're like literally like systemically or systematically eradicating the true horse lovers from the sport by exploiting them to such a degree that it robs them of the joy that they used to have in the horse world. And then we're enabling people who utilize horses for profit and don't actually care about the feelings of the horse in continuing to like spread false rhetoric to everyone else. And that then allows them to exploit people, but also the horses. And yeah, and also, like, one thing I wanna reiterate to anyone listening to this is when I'm referencing the extremely wealthy, I can almost guarantee you I'm not talking about you, because I highly doubt that you are part of, like, the 1% of the population that is hoarding most of the wealth. And I think that a lot of people who are, like, a little bit wealthy and privileged take that and get offended by it when it's like, we're literally not talking about you. Like, you're not driving the biggest part of this problem because you're not, like, the big shot at the top of the sport that is hoarding the most money and is setting the prices and has all of the control. And I have nothing against rich people, but also, like, if you have enough money to be importing several horses a year, showing full time, flying all over the country, and like enjoying horses in the way most people dream of, you're like, I refuse to believe that those people have too little money to pay like a little bit extra on their entry fees to then have their income be pooled into like a sliding scale program that would allow riders to access A-rated shows at a lower price. I find it very hard to believe that the people have that much money to freely buy themselves everything that they like, but that they don't even have a tiny percentage that they could give in addition to their show fees to help other people access the sport. They can afford it, they just choose not to. Because, like, honestly, someone like me, I I donate now. Like, my mom and I probably now donate more money now than we used to when my family was actually considered wealthy before we went bankrupt when I was a kid. We probably are more caring and donate more money now despite having less, because we know how it feels to be someone who is not seen, heard, or cared about, or not helped in society, and to not have access to the stuff that we once took for granted. So now we care more and we're donating to incentives more despite having less money. And it was easier to ignore people's struggles when we were doing really well because we were only looking at life through our very, very privileged rose tinted lens. And I think that's also something everyone needs to consider, is that if you can afford to import like a $50,000 horse, like that's how much a lot of people make in a singular year or less. If you can afford to do that and then still carry on showing and paying training fees and boarding fees, going to school, paying for your car, living in your house, and all that stuff, you're doing really well. And I think that if you were to lose all that stuff and realize what it's like to not have that ease and then have no one care about how hard it is for you, then you would understand how shitty it is. So this is the mindset that I want people to take on, even if these problems don't affect you, is like, consider how you would feel if the roles were reversed and no one was helping you. And what I'm trying to do and like how I conduct my life is like give people a voice that I felt I didn't have when I was struggling, and then also like try to help people with like the privileges that I do have so that they don't have to struggle as much. Like, if you wouldn't want to be in their position and if you wouldn't want to struggle through that with a lack of help, then use your position in the world to try to help those people, even if it's just by using your voice to promote them. And like, I have a platform. So me using my platform to do this is still helpful, and it doesn't require any monetary output on my part other than time. But in addition to that, like, as I build my business more, I want to start doing bursaries and scholarship funds because I'll be able to. And like, all of these people that are making this level of revenue, I can't even fathom pulling in the income that these people can. But like, they have the means to be doing more with their money, but it's like, at the end of the day, it's a choice. Like, you're choosing to not care about people that aren't directly involved in your life and whose struggles you have chosen not to really care about. And it's a choice. But everyone who has the money to be showing on the rated circuit, I find it hard to believe that if you added like a clause on like a show thing where they had to donate, like, I don't know, let's say like 10% of your overall entry fee. So like, that's like what, like $100 on $1,000 thing. You're telling me that people who are riding $500,000 horses don't have $100 extra to give per show to a fund that could then help people access the sport at a lowered rate or offer scholarships. You're telling me that these people can't even give that, because like $100 to people who are that rich is like the equivalent to me putting a quarter in the fucking donation bin at McDonald's or less. Like, honestly, like, that's how it comes down to. And it's like, it doesn't put me out at all. Like, even if I'm broke, donating a dime isn't going to make or break the fact that I'm broke. And I have donated stuff like that when I'm broke because it makes me feel better about myself, and it's a way to pay it forward. Because I don't know, I'm a big believer in karma and like trying to put into the world what you would want back. And like, these people could afford it, and I don't believe that they're so strapped for cash that they can afford to be showing at the level they are repeatedly as much as they are and have this quantity of people doing so and not be able to like just pay like a tiny, like a fractional percentage more just to make the sport more accessible to people. And I think what it comes down to is that people don't want the sport to be more accessible. I don't know why. I don't know if it's like a fear that then the poor people will come and like beat you or something, and they'll be embarrassed if they're beat by horses who cost less. I don't know what the motivation is, but it's very clear to me that these types of people are actively trying to make the horse world less accessible. Like, it's a deliberate attempt because there's no real reason to just not care otherwise. And a lot of them will claim that they donate and that they care and stuff, but then they don't even use their platform to speak on important issues. So in those cases, it's like I find it hard to donate if you find it aversive for people to be like, hey, can you cover this topic with your large following and big voice? Because it would pull a lot of donations to this important issue. And if you're choosing not to do that on a regular basis, I find it hard to believe that in your free time you're donating your money anywhere of value, because if you're too embarrassed to like have your name associated with any type of social movement that promotes equity, then like why would you be donating your money in secret, you know? Like, and like obviously some people might be, but like I don't know, I don't have a lot of trust in it, and I think it's very, like, encouraged for these people not to speak out on issues. Like, I've just written 2 posts about it, on my Facebook, and the follow-up post addressed, like, disabled riders and their lack of access, and I had able-bodied equestrians coming on there being like, "Oh, well, like, they get lots of programs, and, like, they get their own Olympics, and they get, like, government grants are given to people who take on disabled riders, they don't need more access," and it's like, why are you, as a able-bodied person, speaking out on an issue that I guarantee you, like, just by how they're talking, I guarantee you, they've made no fucking effort to talk to any disabled people about? None. They're just saying it. They've made no effort to ask people about their struggles. They are literally just saying what they wanna say without actually trying to talk to anyone. And that's really easy to do, and I guarantee you at some point I've probably said some ignorant shit about stuff that I didn't know what I was talking about, because everyone has probably done it. Um, and even with disabled issues, like, I don't know what disabled people go through to the full extent. My dad is disabled, so it gave me more of a personal view on what it's like, especially, like, since he became like, I knew him when he was able-bodied, and then he had a stroke and became disabled, so it was a very clear difference, and I also saw the mental health repercussions of how losing control of your body like that really impacts people. So even just from the mental health component, that's enough of a barrier that, like, I don't think people accurately depict that. And for him, like, he would be hard pressed if he decided he wanted to be a rider. We'd have to work really hard to find a barn that's willing to take him. And I do understand that there's barns that can't take people who have disabilities for safety reasons, and that's perfectly understandable, but like trying to claim that the access is there and that like any disabled person can just decide to go to the Paralympics and that it's accessible and doesn't require money and privilege is just absurd. And also trying to claim that disabled people have the same access to the opportunities that we suggest to able-bodied people is also a lie. Like, even if a disabled person wanted to take on a working student position that would exploit them, they probably wouldn't be taken because the employer wouldn't want to take on someone that they couldn't squeeze as much labor out of. And that means that they're robbed of a lot of these free opportunities that people claim make the sport accessible, which means that our sport actually isn't that accessible if we're not taking on people for exploit like opportunities that exploit them, but like you're still not taking on people if they're like too slow, if they have a disability, if they like have like honestly even non-physical disabilities like ADHD and like autism and stuff, people wouldn't want to take you on for that if there's anything that would even remotely make them uncomfortable. It doesn't even matter if it impedes your day-to-day work. If you're stimming and they don't like it, they could decide to just not take you, and that is ableism right there. And even like for someone like me, like I have ADHD and I'm pretty high functioning, and like I was able to get through school with like minimal help and like do well in school, but like it was hard. And, like, I'm forgetful, like, I might have to ask the same thing when I'm learning, like, the schedule and stuff, especially due to, like, a pervasive fear of doing something wrong. Like, whenever I was working at Barnes when I was younger, I would have to ask lots of questions, and it resulted in people mistreating me and being mean to me for asking questions, which then made me afraid to ask questions. So then sometimes I would stop asking them, but then I would do things wrong, and then I would be punished for that. And this is with a disability that I would say, like, I'm high functioning and it wouldn't impact me in the same way a lot of other people might be impacted by theirs. And that still was situations where it impacts how I'm treated in the workplace and how likely places would be to hire me, especially when I was younger and unmedicated and whatnot. And people bully these types of, like, even in regular training programs, if you're even a little bit, like, divergent mentally or physically, people will make fun of you. Like, I got someone telling me that as a rider, like, I'm inherently less balanced than any rider who does not have scoliosis, because I have scoliosis. So I literally cannot completely straighten my back to the full degree because I have a fucking curve in my spine. And someone was like, "Oh, well, like, you should fix that." And it's like, pardon? And, like, also, like, some people will have, like, even minimal things, like having, like, one leg that's shorter than the other or having a leg that is, like, less strong. Trainers still abuse kids for it because 'cause they'll just get mad at them for not being able to do what they're asking instead of trying to figure out how they can teach them to ask properly and, like, develop the skills that they need. So there's, like, an awful lot of ableism in the sport that then impacts people getting opportunities like jobs, getting lessons, trainers, lease horses, being able to buy horses, and so on and so forth. And, like, we also heavily encourage people to mask their struggles and to, like, try to assimilate into, like, the, like, neurotypical world that is the horse world, when honestly, like, I think a lot of horse people are not neurotypical. Like, I've met a lot of neurodivergent horse trainers and people. So, like, why are we trying to make people assimilate and, like, fulfill, like, what we think things should look like or, like, how we think people should learn instead of just, like, a teaching style is not successful if it has, like, high chances of behavioral fallout and also fails to work on a large portion of the population, and a lot of trainers' teaching styles apply that. And then, like, yeah, even with physical disabilities, like, the amount of pressure that is put on riders to have good equitation, and this is not me saying that it's okay to just not care about your equitation. Equitation has a function and a purpose, but, like, we've painted it in such a way that we're making equitation out to be like this one size fits all approach that looks the same on everyone, and then it results in body shaming and also ableism for not being considerate of how different people need to ride. And so what I mean by this is that, like, the equitation body is a thing. Like, they encourage young riders to lose weight to look a certain way because it's easier to judge you in equitation. And, like, equitation is just how you ride with the body you have. So someone who is disabled and might be missing a leg or might have limited ability to, like, have the same control over their nerves as someone who's not disabled, their equitation will look different because they are riding with the body they are in. And even for someone like me who is, like, mostly able-bodied, I have old injuries and, like, my pelvis is tilted. So I have a like I have to make up for that in my riding. So how I adapt to certain situations and how I might ride, especially when things aren't going as planned, is with that in mind of maintaining, like, the body that I'm in and that I have. And for me, for example, I have really long arms and really long legs. I call myself an orangutan. I have no upper body. My upper body is literally a fraction of my height. That's why I look like I'm literally 2 feet tall when I'm sitting down. But I'll look tall when I'm sitting on a horse because I have such long legs. My equitation will not look the same as someone who has a long torso and shorter legs because we are completely different body types. How we would fold over and look over a jump looks different. And how I fold over in 2 point for a jump will look different than someone who does not have scoliosis because I lack the ability to flatten the lower part of my back in the same way as someone without scoliosis. And so this is all like these are all just like little things, like stuff that you don't even notice. Like when I'm walking around, people probably just think I have bad posture, which I do when I'm walking around. But they wouldn't be able to look at me and know that I have scoliosis going on. And you can't look at me and just know that I have ADHD unless you also have ADHD. People might notice, but like you can't look at people and know something's wrong in a lot of cases. So the entire concept of equitation, where we like assume and like enforce these ideals on other people, just judging them at face value, I think is pretty dangerous in itself because like we need to start taking into the body differences into equitation, like even the difference between like yeah different body types, like someone who is not built like me, someone who weighs more than me is going to ride differently than me and their body will look different when they're riding than I would. But that doesn't mean that they have bad equitation. There could be a rider who is heavier than me that has a way stronger leg, way stronger back, and is just more correct overall and riding their horse better. And they should pin. It should not matter if someone is skinnier. They should fucking win. their equitation is better. They're a quieter rider. They're riding their horse better. They're riding more ethically. Their horse looks happier, and they're riding with the body they have. Like, equitation is how you ride the horse. That includes different bodies. So even just how like a lot of equitation pictures are drawn, I think it's wrong because most of them depict skinny riders who are all built the same, like usually with like a regular person sized torso, not short like mine, and longer legs, but they're usually like the tall, skinny body type. And there's nothing wrong with having that type of body type. Absolutely nothing wrong with it. But it is not the only body type that exists. So when we normalize and perpetuate that in the horse world as like what is good equitation, it's inherently body shaming everyone who cannot fit that body type. Like, I can't sprout a taller torso. I can't I guess I could get surgery for my scoliosis, but like I can't just like you'd have to get surgery then. You see what I'm saying? And like you got to ride with the body you have. Like, even for me, I have bad knees, probably from riding. So when I'm sore, I'll ride differently. And like, yes, it probably does affect my balance in those cases, but also I'm riding with the body I have on any given day, and no one is at 100% 24/7. Otherwise, it wouldn't be your best attempt. And yeah, and then also like the other problem with the equitation thing is that like women or people who are like female presenting who are heavier get disproportionately criticized when compared to men. So anyone who at face value people will assume is societally feminine and female like, when you carry more weight, you're going to be criticized heavier. Whereas bigger men can ride around on these tiny little stock horses, even as 2-year-olds. And they can, in theory, like these men might be taller and they might appear to be skinny, but they're like 200 pounds and they're riding around on these little baby horses, but they're men. Like, for example, my boyfriend Jesse is like 6'2", so he would be like a tall, like a bigger person. But if you put a woman who is shorter and weighs the exact same weight as him and you put them both on a horse, he probably would get less criticism despite being less experienced and less strong of a rider because he's a tall man. And the woman who is shorter and curvier would get more criticism. And that also plays into how we depict and view equitation, because it's all about like completely like doing a one size fits all approach to how everyone can ride and do things. And it's really problematic because it also takes like, it makes it where it's like more taboo to criticize like any man, which in turn like increases how heavily women are criticized. And like, I'm just gonna check my phone. But yeah, like it's just the sexism is shit. The sexism is real. And I hate how equitation is depicted big time. Oh my god, my hip is sore. Speaking of being sore. Perfect. My package got delivered. But yeah, I'm going to end this live soon, but that was kind of a rant that I wanted to go on because like I think that it is important to talk about. And like I reap benefits from how they depict like the traditional equitation body because people like how long my legs are. But like also like I don't really want to compete in a horse world that is like literally rigged in favor of people who are just like lucky enough to like have what we've decided for whatever reason is like the equitation type body, or like what people like to look at better. Like it would be way more fair if you're actually just riding against who is the better rider. And yeah, but that's kind of that. Like there's a whole lot of ableism, and like for anyone who's watching this, because there's always someone, I doubt they'll make it this far into this if they don't like me, but like for anyone, like especially the people who are posting ableist comments on my post that I posted on Facebook, basically my only recommendation to people like this is like, before you start trying to speak out on the struggles of others and how impacting they are, literally pause for a moment and go fucking talk to people who actually deal with them, because it's way too easy to like underrepresent how much people struggle when you've literally never had to consider dealing with it. Like it is the easiest thing to do. It requires absolutely no empathy and no intelligence, and you can just shrug it off and be like, it doesn't exist because I haven't seen it. Like literally just go ask. This also applies to like riders of color and stuff. Like on TikTok recently, I had some asshole make fun of my hair. He's like, style your hair. Cause like I had got up or I had just gotten off a horse, and I have curly hair. My dad is black, like I have his hair. So especially like when I've been sleeping or wearing a hat, like it can get frizzy. And that in itself was like a microaggression that only happens to people who have hair like me, and it disproportionately impacts people of color because my type of textured hair is a trait of people of color. So even though my skin tone is light and I'm white passing, I still face certain levels of racism for my hair because we've created this narrative in society that like curly hair, frizzy hair, textured hair is like messy and dirty and gross. And same thing applies to like black people who have dreads and like certain types of braid hairstyles too. Workplaces will turn them down and call them unprofessional. And a white person might think that I'm overreacting by pointing out that that is a microaggression and saying that it's like racism against like black hair types. And it's easy to do when it's not impacted you because a white person would go like, "Oh, well like my straight hair is sometimes messy. Like everyone has messy hair sometimes." And it's like, "Well, yeah, but if I had straightened my hair and gotten out of bed and filmed the same fucking video, my hair could have been matted and gross, and if it's straight, I wouldn't have gotten the same comment." And it's easy to make claims like that when you're not the one dealing with the issue, and instead of doing so, you should really like ask the person like, "Hey, like can you explain to me why this is a microaggression, or can you explain to me why you struggle with this? How prevalent are the struggles of these people?" It's really not that hard to just ask about people's experiences, and like taking the initiative to do so will actually teach you some pretty cool stuff about people that you might previously not have liked. Like actually listening to people's stories and like how they struggle, it teaches you empathy because you learn about like what affects them and like what's led people to being how they are, or in the situations that they're in, and like how they struggle differently because of you. Like for me and my family, before my dad was disabled, anytime we would go out and go to eat, if there was no wheelchair ramp or anything, we didn't care. It didn't matter. It didn't affect us. It was easy to ignore because it wasn't a problem that ever impacted us and that we ever had to think of. And the only way it would have impacted us before he became disabled would have been if we saw a disabled family struggling to get into a restaurant without a ramp and heard their complaints. That's the only way we would actually have that issue displayed out in front of us. And when he became disabled and we had to start to consider these things, it became really clear that the world is rigged against people like him because they like people are like everything is about accommodating like able-bodied people. Like as far as I'm concerned, it's like why even have stairs? Like if you can only afford to do stairs or a ramp, why not just get a ramp? Because then everyone can go up and down it and everyone can join in and enjoy themselves. And yeah, oh yeah, for the I'll for the person that's saying about a disability income disparity, I'd love to talk about that too because I've learned some more stuff. Like I have to look up the laws here in Canada, but I know in the States that disabled people lose their benefits if they get married. I'm not sure if it's the same here. I think my dad retained his disability fund even when he remarried. I'll check with him. But yeah, like there's a lot of stuff that is literally rigged directly against disabled people to make their lives harder. And the same applies to people who are like people of color as well. There's a lot of little things that you get used to dealing with that make life harder. And like you learn to shrug it off to an extent because it's just something you have to deal with and pack around all day. And it's a reality of your life. So a lot of these people deal with it pretty graciously and they don't make a big deal about it. But that doesn't mean it's not a big deal. It just means that it's something that they are trapped in, like a situation they can't change, and they don't really see it changing. So you kind of have to make the best you can out of a shitty situation that isn't considering you. And I think that this is the struggle a lot of people of color and disabled people go through, and like people like LGBTQ people, like all like there's these little things that do not impact whatsoever, like how good someone can be with horses that would result in them not being hired into certain positions or not getting the same level of opportunities. Like even in the horse world, like it's still quite taboo to there's so many conservative places that I would like conservative people in the horse world that I would say the horse world is not like the safest place to just be like out and about as like a gay person or a transgender person, or even just be wandering around as like a clearly person of color. especially when you haven't like created friendships that provide you some level of safety, because there's enough racist and homophobic and transphobic people in the community that you could get targeted simply just by existing. And obviously that exists everywhere outside of the horse world as well. But these are all little things that like we take for granted if you're not impacted by these problems, that we don't even pause for a moment to consider. Like, I've never been transgender, but from what I've seen of how conservative and unkind horse people are and how they do not value other people's struggles, it wouldn't surprise me at all to hear about people being discriminated from jobs for being transgender and not getting the same level of opportunities, or um not getting like judged as fairly if they decide they just don't like the fact that you're swaying from what they view to be the status quo. Like, I've heard from people of color like that aren't white passing like me, that they get judged more unfairly compared to white people. And obviously it depends on the judge. But there's been riders who will put in really, really good rounds and be pinned below people who had objectively worse rounds. And there's not really anything there to demonstrate what the bias is other than the color of their skin or something like that. And that's something to consider as someone who has privilege, because like one thing that really bothers me when people discredit like what I say and don't want to listen to like, yeah, like the thing about the microaggression stuff, is that like having like listening to white people say that to me as like a white passing half black person drives me up the wall, because it's like, even me as someone who is half black, like I still have to check myself and listen to people who are like black and like not white passing, because they are living in a different world than I am. They get more criticism and judgment because of how they look and because they are presenting as a black person, whereas I can pass as a white person. So that provides me with a safety net, which means that it would be easier for me to trivialize the problems of someone who does not have that safety net, because I have not experienced it as directly. So even as someone who has a black family, it is still my job to listen to the struggles of other riders of color and what they experience, because I have the safety net of having lighter colored skin that allows me to assimilate easier and not have people as readily point out the fact that I'm a person of color. And what this also means is that I'm subject to people being racist in front of me a lot more, because they think that I'm like in on it with them. And luckily in the local community now, it's pretty well known that I'm a person of color, and I post so much about like racial rights stuff that like anyone who actually knows who I am would be pretty fucking stupid to do it in front of me, because they would know they're in for something. But like that's how much more comfortable racist people feel around me based off of how I look. And that kind of shows how I get treated and like categorized as a white person, whereas someone who is darker than me doesn't get that same benefit. I feel weird calling it a benefit, but it is one, because it's not like you're not being targeted for your skin color. So the fact that I, as someone who is actually from that ethnic background, can admit that and say that I have biases and inherent privileges because of being white passing, but white people will literally argue with me about the fact that they couldn't possibly be racist, and that like I don't know what I'm talking about, and then they try to dictate what is and isn't racism. It's like, you don't get to do that. Like, you've never been impacted by this. Like, stay in your lane and just listen and ask money. And sorry, I was reading someone's thing about money, and ask questions, not money. But I mean, like, if you want to send people money for reparations after being like unkind to them and when they've dealt with racism and transphobia and homophobia, do it. Buy them a treat, because they put up with a lot of bullshit every day just existing and being who they are. And yeah, so I think that like that's something to consider also. And like someone in the chat was talking about, that there's like a whole thing of people maliciously misgendering them to get a reaction. And like that's also like extremely unkind. Like I have met a lot of older people in the horse industry that mean very well, that have a hard time understanding pronouns and are trying. And there's an inherent difference from those people and those who weaponize misgendering people on purpose just to be an asshole. And the whole thing with misgendering that I don't get is, it doesn't even matter if like you don't need to understand. You don't need to understand like why someone is transgender or like anything like that to just respect them, you know? It's like no different than the way I've worded it to really conservative people. And like, I would appreciate it if a transgender person would tell me if this is okay or not. Like, the comparison that I use for people who are being ignorant like that is, I'll look at them and I'll go like, okay, but like if your friend decided to legally change their name and the name made them happy, you would start calling them by that name because it makes them happy and because it's the right thing to do. It doesn't matter if you prefer their old name or if you're more comfortable with their old name. If they want to be called something else, that is their business and it makes them happy. And if you decide not to do it, then you're a shitty person because you're putting your own preference just of the sound of what you're calling them above the person's comfort and happiness over what they would like to be referred to as. And that was a comparison that I used for some people who were like saying that they didn't understand like why pronouns mattered, and I was like, well, it doesn't really matter if it matters to you or not. Like you're referencing a person, so the only thing that matters in that setting is how they feel about it, because at most it's like a minor inconvenience to relearn different pronouns and like different means of talking to people. At most it's an inconvenience because like sure, if you get used to only using the binary, it becomes habitual and you might misgender people incorrectly when you're first meeting them because it's something you're used to. But it's a minimal effort to start using different pronouns and to start just referring to people how they want to be referred to as. So people who aren't willing to do that are selfishly just saying like I don't give a fuck about other people and I'm not even willing to minorly inconvenience at most. Like I don't even like using the term inconvenience because I don't think it even is that, but they're not willing to minorly even put themselves out a little bit just to make someone else more comfortable. And I think that's absurd. Like if I ever misgender someone, I want them to correct me right off the bat because I'm not trying to do that. And I think it's important to make people feel comfortable in their bodies and who they are. And like I would never do that intentionally ever, but like a lot of horse people do. I like and I've seen them do it. And that's the comparison I used for the one person that I've heard do this. And I'm wondering if that is an okay way of explaining it as like a non-transgender person, because I try to do it in a way that's not going to completely flame them up because some of the people get so heated that it's like not constructive. But I also know that like it's safer for me to correct them than it is for a transgender person to correct them. And also, if I correct them as someone who's cisgendered, then they're probably less likely to get like, I don't know, like it's definitely like a transphobic mindset that they're in. And I find that like they like if a cisgendered person speaks up, it's kind of like when someone's being sexist towards women and a man speaks up, a man is more likely to listen to a guy telling them that they're a fucking nimrod for being sexist. And like I just want to use my platform the best way possible to like correct people if I can. And like the person who did that was like the same guy that was like racist to me, so that should have been a red flag number one. But um yeah, like that's kind of how I've been trying to explain it to people, because I've had a few clients who have like who are trying, like they're who are trying to learn but are confused. And when they're not on the internet, because I've learned so much from being on the internet and on TikTok and stuff, and like following, like I like to follow like indigenous people, people from different backgrounds and like transgender people so that I can learn stuff because they're sharing their information for free. And like it lets me just learn like kind of how to conduct myself to be like as welcoming as possible. And that's been super helpful for me for trying to like advocate for people more and just like understanding the struggles that people go through. And I wish more people would do that, but unfortunately a lot of like our most like entrenched and racist and transphobic people in the community are also part of like the demographic that is on the internet less and is probably accessing that information less. And obviously it's not transgendered people's job to educate these people in the first place, but they're not accessing the same thing, so it's almost reliant on people verbally correcting them day to day. And it's something that I've found that a lot of horse people are not comfortable with and that they're willing to ignore if they're cisgendered. So I think that that's kind of where we need to start with like anyone, like whether it's like racism, transphobia, homophobia, like sexism, etc. Like before you write off something as not being an issue that impacts people, like start talking to the people who are actually impacted by it and like learn their side and talk to them and make an effort. Because like I've learned so much about like the gender binary and like how it was created. Like I started watching Getting Curious with Jonathan on Netflix, and they did a whole episode on the gender binary, and I learned a lot of stuff that I had no idea about that was like fascinating to me, about how like they've literally weaponized this system to like try to eradicate gay and transgender people. And it also is like closely linked to racism and like the efforts that society has taken to do that. But like not everyone puts in the effort to learn those things because it can be uncomfortable. But it all starts with, like, even just, like, just asking someone about their situation. Like, instead of responding with, "No, you're wrong, that makes me uncomfortable, I don't believe you," we could start just asking people, like, "Hey, like, why does this impact you in this way? Or why are you saying that this is this way?" Um, and yeah, so it's kinda like it's all reliant on us, and I think that, like, the young people do need to start speaking up more to the older people, which is something I've struggled with in the past, and, like, when I did finally speak up to, like, my trainer who was being really abusive, to people, not really the horses, it was, like, empowering because it gave me, like, the confidence to kinda start doing it more, but prior to that, it was honestly really hard to, like, correct people. I could hear them saying ignorant things, and it would be really anxiety inducing and hard to speak up. And like I know I'm coming from a place of privilege to even speak on them because I'm not someone who's going to be deliberately targeted just for how I look because I'm white passing. And yeah, it takes practice, but it's necessary because otherwise you're, like, facilitating bullying by being that person that is in the background when injustice is happening, listening to it happen, and, like, honestly, for someone to feel safe and, like, accepted, sometimes all it takes is just having, like, that extra person there to be like, "That was wrong, and this person's being an asshole, and I'm gonna call them out on it, and, like, are you okay?" And, like, how even if, like, it's one person in, like, a crowd, at least the person that is being targeted isn't alone anymore, and, like, the more we do that, I think the more we encourage empathy because we're sharing people's experiences and, like, how they suffer and how they might have certain issues that they struggle with, and then it kind of just, like, opens the discussion, and, like, that's what I would really like to see in the horse world. No, that's my boyfriend being silly. You guys can bully him though if you want to. It's okay. He just comes on my lives and trolls. So he's just around. But yeah, I'm gonna go and get riding in a second because now I can get help with my youngster. And yeah, yeah. But no, I think that this is a topic that people just need to consider, like all of the topics that I've discovered, because it really doesn't cost anything and it requires very little to just start getting curious about like other people's situations and not just assume that we know what's going on, because like it's way too easy to just assume that you're like the expert on everything and that you know um, what someone is struggling with, because you really can't until you've like actually spoken to them. And like honestly, like even for people in your day-to-day lives, like your friends and stuff, they all have shit that's going on that you're not necessarily going to be aware of. Like a lot of the stuff that I've struggled with the last many years happened without my friends being aware of it. And like and that's not faulting friends at all, because it's stuff that like I would have intentionally hidden from people and not wanted to talk about, but like making these things less taboo and just opening the door to discuss it and kind of normalize the discussion and make people feel less alone enables people in like not feeling as like alone in a shitty situation. um and yeah, so anyways, this live kind of got off topic from like the day by day stuff. So if anyone here came for that, it's at the beginning when I post this. But yeah, that's kind of like just the gist of like my feelings on the horse world and changes I would like to see, because it is hard being part of such a conservative like sport that is like so whitewashed until fairly recently, especially because like we didn't even used to see people of color being featured in like magazines and stuff. Um, for like horse stuff. So like all that's very new and I'm seeing like a lot of positive changes, but I think we can continue to like bring the momentum um simply by just talking and like opening the doors to discuss about like problems that haven't actually gotten a platform in the past, because like in previous years we wouldn't have like if you tried to make a platform to discuss racial discrimination in the horse world, it probably wouldn't have been received as well as it's being received now. And like still people don't receive things as well, but it's getting better because we're getting more progressive. So like the more people keep pushing, like it actually is making a difference. And I've had lots of people tell me that like speaking out doesn't matter and that it doesn't do anything and to stop complaining, but like I've literally seen the changes it makes. And I've had people who've like notoriously posted hate comments on my page come back after like a couple of years and be like, I've learned something and changed how I feel. And yeah, so it's just yeah, it's something that I think that we can really bring more momentum from and like continue to improve the horse world. And like it'll also benefit everyone because it's just like more empathy and like giving more of a platform to the lesser heard voices rather than giving the largest platform to the people at the very tops of the sport who in actuality account for like very little of the people competing. So yeah, it all starts somewhere and like we can do it. So yeah. But yeah, I hope that this was interesting and helpful for people. The other thing that before I sign off is that I am trying to do an article on like accessibility in the horse world. So I'm interviewing marginalized groups, like including like disabled people, like whether it's a physical or mental disability, and like LGBTQ community, like people of color, and just like anyone who has kind of felt like marginalized or discriminated against in the horse world. I'd love to hear your stories about like some of the inequity and like how you've experienced it because I'm trying to cover that in a post that I'll be doing later. And I want to do like interviews of people to point out specific issues that I won't necessarily be aware of because I'm not impacted by them. And I wanted to kind of go directly to the source. So for anyone who is interested in doing that, you can email me at shelby@milestoneequestrian.com. All of the info for like contacting me and stuff should be down in the description below, or you can just go to my website and Shelby@milestoneequestrian.ca, not .com. But yeah, all of the info should be down in the description below, or you can go to my website and see it there. But if anyone is interested in sharing their stories, I would love to cover it because I was pretty appalled. Like most of the commentary was like positive on like my recent Facebook post, but it was like pretty gross to see like the number of ableist people that came out of the woodwork and were wanting to like basically be like, oh, this isn't a problem, and just like desperate to sweep issues under the rug instead of being like, yeah, like I don't know exactly how to fix this problem in full, but we should start trying instead of just ignoring it. Because like I don't know, you can point issues out without like having a full solution and then hope that like the discussion of them will lead you to like a better solution. It doesn't need to be the perfect solution at first, but like a slight improvement is better than stagnating for like another decade in this horse world. So yeah, so that's kind of what I'm going to cover. And then yeah, so I'm going to go roll out and do some horse things and drink some water because now I have like an exceptionally dry mouth. But those are my thoughts on some industry issues. And if anyone's interested in sharing their struggles or has anything for me to learn that you think would be like relevant to write on, please contact me because I want to make sure it's covered as like accurately as possible and not like doing an injustice to like different people's struggles. I don't want to be inconsiderate due to like lack of experience with certain struggles. So I would love to hear people and your struggles if you're willing to share them, of course. Like no worries if you're not. Don't feel like obligated to contact me unless you truly want to share. And if you also want to share anonymously, I'm totally happy to keep things anonymous. So totally up to anyone else. I'm happy to hear stories and would love to share them because I think it's just important to kind of start normalizing different stories and giving more of a platform to people that aren't typically featured in a lot of horse articles or on pages or in the media. And like, yeah, you know what I'm saying. So anyways, yeah, I'll leave this up. And this is probably the last update I'm doing on the day by day thing unless they contact me. So yeah, I'm going to roll out and do that. And if they contact me, then maybe I'll do an update video and see. I'm glad that they're at least looking into the issue more. That's great. And I hope that it gets sorted out because I think that their daughter will continue to improve a lot more on a horse who's more balanced and makes it a little bit easier for her to focus on herself. So yeah, thank you everyone for listening to this live stream. And I hope you took something out of it. And just remember that it costs nothing to like listen to a marginalized person's views instead of yelling over top of them and being like, actually, that doesn't happen, because I, as someone who is not in this marginalized group, has never experienced it. Costs you nothing. Just ask them. Truly just ask. It's not that hard. And trust me, like if you grow up with a silver spoon in your mouth, you probably have more privileges that you're unaware of that you think everyone has than you realize. And I say that from experience. So it's up to you to kind of undo those biases and to be aware of them and to educate yourself so that you are with reality and not living in your own little land. So anyways, cheers and goodbye. Yeah, last thing is that my spring saddle pad designs are released. So if anyone is interested in checking out some of the new ones, link down below. and bridles are on pre-order. I've offered 2 new sizes for pre-orders. Or if anyone needs like mixed sizing, I would recommend doing a pre-order because then you can leave in your order notes what sizes you want. So, anyways, check that out and have a great day. Hope this was fun for people. Yay. Ah.